Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now let us begin. Story 1. The shaking temples of ancient Delphi, Greece before earthquake science. You are standing in the sacred valley of Phasis, beneath the towering slopes of Mount Parnassus. The cicadas hum gently around you, and the dust is warm beneath your sandals. The year is somewhere between 750 and 500 BCE, but it hardly matters. Time here moves slowly, like the stones that form the great terraces of the Temple of Apollo. You are in Delphi, and the ground under your feet is never quite still. In the heart of the ancient Greek world, Delphi held a curious mix of spiritual centrality and geological instability. Known for the oracle, or Pythia, Delphi was less a town and more a sanctuary, a kind of sacred amphitheater built upon trembling earth. To live here was to balance reverence with risk, though the concept of an earthquake zone wouldn't have meant anything to those who did. And yet the earth did move. The Greeks, like many ancient peoples, had no formalized understanding of seismic activity. What they did have were gods. Earthquakes were explained as expressions of divine mood swings, usually the wrath of Poseidon the earth shaker. But while this belief satisfied a metaphysical yearning for cause and meaning, it left the people with no predictive tools, no measurements, no warnings, only stories and omens. Still, Delphi endured. The settlement, if you could call it, that was precariously perched atop a major fault line, later known in modern geological terms as the Delphi Fault. Today, geologists have confirmed the area is a tectonic nightmare. But to the ancients, its instability seemed to be part of its mystique. It was not feared, but embraced because what better place for the gods to whisper than one where the earth itself murmured? The Pythia, the priestess through whom Apollo supposedly spoke, was said to receive her visions while sitting atop a tripod over a fissure in the rock. From this chasm, sweet-smelling vapors rose, perhaps ethylene or other natural gases released due to seismic microfractures in the rock. The priestess would enter a trance-like state, babble unintelligibly, and a cadre of male priests would translate her words into riddling prophecy. Modern speculation links this ritual to small tectonic releases, subtle quakes that fractured limestone and allowed gases to seep upward. The foundation of divination, it seems, may have been geological. But what did day-to-day life look like in this sacred zone of soft instability? For one thing, structures were built with an understanding, even if not a scientific one, that the earth was unreliable. Ancient Greek builders, especially at Delphi, often relied on limestone blocks and flexible wooden beams, materials that could flex and give under pressure. Whether by accident or instinct, they created spaces that withstood moderate quakes surprisingly well. Even more curiously, there seems to have been an unspoken acknowledgement of seismic risk in urban design. Temples and treasuries, each city-state had its own small monument in Delphi, were spaced out. The Sacred Way, a winding path leading up to the temple, moved visitors gradually uphill, not in steep, vulnerable ascents. The amphitheater was built into the rock itself, less a freestanding structure and more a hollow carved from solidity. But then came the tremors. Historical records from Delphi are scarce and filtered through myth, but we know of at least two major seismic events that caused damage during antiquity. The most notable came in 373 BCE, when a powerful earthquake devastated parts of central Greece. In Delphi, the event was seen as both punishment and purification, a divine reshuffling. Later writers, like the Roman geographer Strabo, wrote of temples crumbling and the rearrangement of sacred relics. The earth was never still, but in these moments it screamed. And yet, rather than abandon Delphi, the people rebuilt it. Why stay? Perhaps it was economic. Delphi drew pilgrims and tributes from all over the Greek world. Perhaps it was cultural. Delphi was the omphalos, the navel of the world as decreed by Zeus himself. Or perhaps it was psychological. When you live in a place that quivers, you adapt not by resisting the tremors but by folding them into your identity. Delphi was sacred not despite the quakes, but because of them. In times of relative calm, life would have proceeded with ritual precision. Pilgrims climbed the sacred way bearing questions. Should I go to war? Should I marry? Should I found a colony across the sea? They brought offering statues, shields, gold leaf trinkets, all of which filled the treasuries that still stand in ruin today. Meanwhile, the people who lived in and around Delphi cultivated olive groves, raised goats, and maintained the sanctuary in return for trade and protection. And always the ground hummed, subtly, quietly, enough to remind you of your smallness. It's worth pausing here to consider the silence of written records. Earthquakes did not always make the scrolls of history unless they coincided with great battles or portents. Yet the archaeology tells its own story. Rebuilt walls, shifted foundations, reused stonework, these are signs not of aesthetic remodeling, but of seismic survival. The people of Delphi may not have written manuals on earthquake preparedness, but they were practitioners of it nonetheless. One curious feature of Delphi is the tholos at the sanctuary of Athena Prania. This round building, visually striking even in ruin, has puzzled archaeologists for generations. Its function is uncertain. Some argue it held symbolic meaning, others believe it was a meeting space. But its design, circular, with columns arranged around a central chamber, offers better resistance to lateral shaking than rectangular structures. Again, intention or accident? We may never know. As centuries passed and empires shifted, Delphi's importance waned. The rise of Christianity eventually led to the closure of the sanctuary under Roman rule. The Pythia's voice fell silent, but the earth did not. Even in modern times, Delphi experiences small tremors. The stones remain angled, broken, sun-bleached. And perhaps if you sit quietly beside the temple of Apollo, you might feel a faint movement beneath you, a whisper from the fault lines, a ghost of a world that lived with instability and found in it something sacred. And so you wonder, did the ancients build their myths on top of seismic memory? Or did the shaking ground shape their gods in the first place? You are sitting at the edge of the Plestos Valley. The wind carries the scent of olives and the subtle dust of limestone. If you were a traveler in the 4th century BCE, you might pause to rest on one of the ancient terraces near the Temple of Apollo and notice something odd. The way stones didn't quite line up, the faint zigzag of staircases that had once stood straight. The cracks, though patched, told stories older than myths. In the previous section, we explored how the Oracle of Delphi Pythia was not just a mouthpiece of Apollo, but also a curious byproduct of a fault line. Now, we must peer deeper into how earthquakes shaped the very bones of the sanctuary itself, not in legend, but in limestone and survival. The sanctuary of Delphi, both religious and political in its importance, faced not just a singular destructive quake, but rather a centuries-long relationship with shifting ground. To understand this, we must begin with one of the most significant known events, the earthquake of 373 BCE. This seismic episode was not minor. Accounts by later historians, especially Diodorus Siculus and Pausanias, describe widespread destruction throughout central Greece. Entire cities like Helike disappeared beneath the waves due to both seismic tremors and resulting tsunamis. Delphi, situated far from the sea but close to the Delphi fault zone, was not spared. The Temple of Apollo, the centerpiece of the sanctuary, reportedly suffered considerable damage. We must pause to consider this temple more closely. By the time of the 373 BCE quake, Delphi had already seen several iterations of the Temple of Apollo. The original had been destroyed by fire around 548 BCE and rebuilt with funds contributed by various city-states, including powerful Athens. The new structure, finished in the early 5th century BCE, was grander and more complex, a statement of unity and religious dedication. It stood not just as a place of prophecy, but as a symbol of Pan-Hellenic identity. And yet, even this reinforced structure could not entirely resist the quaking ground. Archaeological evidence shows that the building was damaged in 373 BCE and underwent significant reconstruction. The cause of the damage, once thought to be erosion or improper construction, is now widely understood to have been seismic. What's more, evidence suggests the rebuilding process was slow and methodical, spread across multiple decades, perhaps even generations. This wasn't negligence, this was caution. Greek architects may not have known what tectonic plates were, but they understood structural failure when they saw it. Rebuilding after the quake involved wider column bases, better distributed weight in the entablature, the horizontal elements above columns, and improvements to the stylobate, the foundation platform of the temple. The stone blocks were fitted with greater precision, sometimes including metal clamps or dowels, a rare innovation for the time. There was a growing architectural intuition, if not theory, that the earth would move again. Interestingly, records from the Delphic Amphictyony, the ancient council responsible for managing the sanctuary, show that the quake and its aftermath influenced regional politics. Funds had to be redirected. Alliances were tested. Earthquakes, it seems, didn't just shape buildings, they shaped policies. And yet, for the people who lived near the sanctuary, life did not stop. Their homes, simple dwellings built into the terrace slopes, likely fared better than monumental structures. Made from lighter materials like mud brick, wood, and rubble stone, they could bend and sway with shaking ground. Damage was still a threat, of course, but flexibility, not rigidity, preserved lives. The same cannot be said for the intricate treasuries that lined the sacred way. These were small, temple-like buildings dedicated by individual city-states to house offerings. Built of marble and other heavy materials, they were symbols of pride and piety. But earthquakes showed no regard for either. Some treasuries collapsed entirely in 373 BCE, and others were so badly damaged that their remains were used in later constructions, a kind of ancient recycling driven not by sustainability, but necessity. One of the best-known examples is the Siphnian treasury, with its ornate frieze depicting mythological scenes. Though its remains still stand today, partially restored, it was likely damaged more than once in antiquity. Its decorative sculptures were eventually removed, buried, or reused. Some pieces were found integrated into later retaining walls, art turned into infrastructure. The earthquake, then, was not a singular event, but part of a rhythmic cycle that Delphi danced with over centuries. Each tremor demanded adaptation. Some shifts were literal, blocks realigned, paths redirected, while others were conceptual. The sanctuary began to adopt a certain humility in construction, favoring sturdiness over elegance in later additions. There is also the question of ritual. Did seismic activity influence how worship was conducted? Consider the tholos of Athena Prania, with its circular plan and concentric arrangement. Built in the early 4th century BCE, around the time of the 373 quake, it stands apart in both shape and symbolism. Circular buildings resist lateral seismic waves more effectively than rectangular ones. Whether by inspiration or experimentation, the architects may have learned from the failures of the Temple of Apollo. Moreover, certain rituals may have evolved to respond to the trauma of earthquakes. We know that the ancient Greeks conducted purification ceremonies after natural disasters, treating them as signs of divine displeasure. In Delphi, special offerings, sometimes of bronze tripods or sacrificial animals, were made in the wake of destruction. The ground may have shaken, but ritual rebalanced the spiritual order. But Delphi's quakes were not just destructive, they were philosophical. You begin to see a pattern in the writings of philosophers like Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi in the 1st century CE. Plutarch mused not only on ethics and metaphysics, but also on the voice of the gods. In his work, On the Obsolescence of Oracles, he ponders why prophetic voices had grown silent in his time. Some scholars believe he was responding to a decline in seismic activity. The vents that once emitted intoxicating vapors had perhaps quieted. The very geology that made Delphi sacred may have also dictated its decline. This raises a deeper question. Was the divine ever separate from the land? In the ancient mind, Apollo's voice echoed because the rocks cracked open. The gods were not above the earth, they were the earth. Poseidon's trident didn't shake the ground metaphorically, it was the mechanism by which tectonic stress was released. To explain a quake was to name a god. In such a world, geology was theology. And so the people of Delphi did not seek to escape their seismic reality. They interpreted it, they built for it, they endured it. A final, curious note. Recent geological studies suggest that the Delphi Fault continues to experience slow, microseismic activity even today. In fact, some scientists theorize that certain areas of the sanctuary are still subtly shifting. The stones remember. But can the memory of stones be trusted? If an earthquake reshaped a temple, and the temple reshaped a god, who in the end shaped the story? You stand now at the ruins of Delphi, where the columns rise like ribbed bones from the dry ground. Light plays across the broken capitals. What once held the sky aloft now lies fractured, moss-covered, and strangely dignified. The people are gone. The gods are silent. But the ground, as always, remembers. In this final section, we reflect on the enduring lessons of Delphi, how the ancients lived with seismic uncertainty, and how their responses, shaped by myth and practicality alike, whisper into the present. The final quakes and the long goodbye. By the early centuries CE, Delphi's influence had waned. The rise of Christianity brought new priorities and new gods. By the time of the Theodosian decrees in the late 4th century CE, pagan temples were being actively closed across the Roman Empire. The oracle fell silent, and with her, the centuries-old bond between geology and prophecy was severed. There are no definitive accounts of Delphi's final quakes during antiquity, but the evidence is geological and architectural. In the Roman era, earthquakes continued to affect the broader region of central Greece, and even minor tremors would have taken their toll on buildings already weakened by time and prior seismic events. By the 6th century CE, much of Delphi had been abandoned. Stone blocks were repurposed in nearby Christian churches. Sacred paths became goat tracks. The once majestic theater hosted only wind and bird song. And yet, the site remained undisturbed in one curious way. It was not buried, as so many ancient cities were, under layers of ash or flood. Delphi decayed in place, exposed, watched by the same mountains that once bore witness to its glory. In this sense, the sanctuary didn't vanish. It faded stone by stone, step by step. Geological memory, human forgetfulness. What then did the ancients truly know about earthquakes? We tend to project our own scientific framework backwards, imagining early engineers as proto-geologists. But Delphi tells a subtler story. Its inhabitants lacked a seismograph, but they possessed something almost as powerful: cultural adaptation. Let us recall a few truths they lived by. Use of flexible materials. Mud brick homes and wooden roof beams allowed ordinary people to ride out moderate quakes. Spatial distribution of structures. Major buildings were often spaced apart, possibly minimizing domino-like collapse. Circular architectural forms. The tholos and similar structures may reflect an early understanding of seismic resistance. Rituals as resets. Earthquakes were folded into cosmology. Each tremor was a sign, painful, yes, but comprehensible. These were not scientific responses in the modern sense. They were ritualized, intuitive strategies. Earthquakes were not problems to be solved, but realities to be integrated into the rhythms of life. The Greeks were not alone in this. Across the ancient world, in Japan, in Peru, in Anatolia, civilizations in quake-prone zones developed not technologies but mentalities. In a world without predictive science, resilience began with worldview. And this worldview was one in which humans were not the masters of nature, but its listeners. Excavation and revelation. Fast forward to the 19th century. Delphi was rediscovered and excavated by European archaeologists, most notably the French in the 1890s. The ruins were meticulously studied, catalogued, and eventually opened to the modern world. But something curious happened during excavation. As layers were removed, signs of multiple reconstructions emerged: foundation stones that had shifted and been reset, staircases rebuilt at slightly different angles, and temple walls that bore the marks of stress fractures. Geologists began to take interest. In the 1990s and early 2000s, seismic studies confirmed the presence of two active fault lines beneath Delphi: the Delphi Fault and the Kurna Fault. Their intersection sits directly beneath the Temple of Apollo. Coincidence? Unlikely. What had once been considered divine mystery was now reframed as tectonic inevitability. The vapors inhaled by the Pythia were likely ethylene or methane, released by fractures caused by minor seismic events. The very act of prophecy, once a purely spiritual exercise, was now seen as an unconscious response to geology. Yet does this diminish Delphi's mystery? Not necessarily. If anything, it reinforces the depth of ancient intuition. The people of Delphi didn't need to define a fault line to feel it. They lived on the pulse of the earth. They heard it, they interpreted it, and they built, not in defiance of it, but in dialogue with it. Lessons for the modern world. Today, we have accelerometers, GPS fault monitoring, and seismic hazard mapping. We can model potential shake zones, build to code, and develop early warning systems. And yet, even now, earthquakes surprise us. Cities like Istanbul, Kathmandu, and San Francisco live with daily uncertainty. Faults don't operate on human timetables. What Delphi offers is not data, but perspective. The ancients could not prevent earthquakes. They accepted this. What they focused on instead was social continuity, spiritual integration, and architectural pragmatism. Their temples may have fallen, but their memory persists, not just because of what they built, but how they built it and why. Delphi's silence today is not absence, it is equilibrium. And if you stand quietly among the ruins as the wind brushes through olive branches and the cicadas start their song, you may sense something. A hum, a pressure, a presence beneath your feet. The earth does not forget. It waits and shifts, and sometimes it speaks. But do we still know how to listen? Story 2. Pachacuti's Gamble, Incan Empire and the Quaking Andes. You are standing at 11,000 feet above sea level, your breath slightly shallow, your steps slow but sure. The Andes rise like ancient waves frozen in stone. Below, the stones of Cusco, once the heart of the Inca Empire, fit together without mortar, so precisely that not even a blade of grass can pass between them. The ground here is alive. It always has been. In this place, long before Europeans crossed the oceans, the Inca carved out one of the most impressive empires the world has ever known. Stretching over 2,500 miles along the spine of South America, their empire climbed mountains, bridged chasms, and defied the natural order. But for all their achievements, the Incas built atop a landscape riddled with danger. The Andes are not passive mountains. They are the visible scars of tectonic fury, the collision of the Nazca and South American plates. This subduction zone makes the region one of the most seismically active on Earth. Earthquakes here do not simply rattle teacups. They destroy cities. They alter rivers. They reshape empires. And yet the Inca built anyway. Their approach to architecture, city planning, and spiritual life reveals a deep and pragmatic relationship with their unstable landscape. But more than that, it reveals a leadership willing to gamble, none more so than the man who transformed a small highland kingdom into the Tahuantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. Pachacuti, Inca Yupanqui. Before Pachacuti, Inca origins and quaking hills. The Inca, as a people, were not the first to inhabit the high Andes. They emerged from a long lineage of Andean civilizations: Tiwanaku, Wari, Chavan, all of which experienced earthquakes and incorporated them, to varying degrees, into their architectural and religious practices. When the Inca first settled in the Cusco Valley, they were one of many small tribes in a competitive and dangerous region. Earthquakes, landslides, and floods were facts of life. The Incas believed that these forces were not random acts of nature, but signs from the gods, especially Pachamama, the Earth Mother, and Alapa, the god of thunder, lightning, and war. Their early architecture reflected a cautious optimism. Mud-brick homes and modest temples were nestled into hillsides, but when the Inca rose to dominance, their ambitions and their stonework transformed. Pachacuti rises, a leader from the rubble. Pachacuti's story begins in the early 15th century, around 1438 CE. His father, Viracocha Inca, ruled Cusco but faced a dire threat from the invading Chanca people. As the story goes, the city was on the verge of collapse. Viracocha fled, but young Pachacuti, then still named Cusi Yupanqui, refused to abandon the city. The Chanca invasion, like many Andean conflicts, may have been influenced by a mix of political pressure and natural stress. Oral histories speak of strange omens, trembling ground, sudden storms, animals behaving erratically. Whether these were real or retroactively imagined is impossible to say. But to the Inca, omens and earthquakes were intertwined. Pachacuti's defense of Cusco was legendary. Not only did he rally the remaining forces, he allegedly summoned stone soldiers Purarocas to confuse the enemy. The myth says these stones came to life and turned the tide of battle. Modern scholars interpret this as symbolic. Pachacuti turned his surrounding stone and landscape into weapons. Earth was not an enemy. It was his ally. After the victory, he took power, and the building began. Earthquake-resistant architecture, strategy, or spirituality. The Inca stonework that survives today is extraordinary not for its scale, but for its precision. Pachacuti's reign marked the beginning of massive urban development, including the expansion of Cusco and the construction of sacred sites like Sacsayhuaman and Machu Picchu. Their masonry, known as ashlar, involved cutting stones into polygonal shapes that fit together without mortar. These irregular blocks locked into place, allowing the walls to absorb seismic energy without collapsing. In earthquake-prone areas, this technique proved vastly superior to European masonry of the same era, which relied heavily on straight walls and mortar. Why did the Inca build this way? Some argue it was aesthetic, a demonstration of imperial skill and power. But it is equally plausible, perhaps more so, that the Inca were responding to a very real threat. The Andes had taught them that no wall was sacred unless it could move with the earth. Pachacuti's engineers designed trapezoidal doors and windows, angled slightly inward, which prevented collapse during tremors. The walls sloped subtly inward as well, creating a stable center of gravity. These were not accidental innovations. They were intentional adaptations to a restless earth. Sacred stones and quaking gods. In Inca belief, stones were not inert. They were alive beings with souls called huacas. Some huacas were natural formations, others were carved or placed deliberately. When earthquakes struck, it was not simply tectonic, it was a form of communication. The gods were displeased or they were shifting balance. Pachacuti took this belief further. He transformed Cusco into a cosmic city, aligning its streets and temples along sex-sacred lines radiating from the Coricancha, the golden temple at the center. These lines connected huacas across the valley, forming a spiritual and geographical network. And yet, even this spiritual geometry bowed to geological reality. Coricancha was one of the most lavish structures in the empire, its inner walls covered in sheets of gold. But its stone foundations were constructed with seismic pragmatism. Even today, after centuries of earthquakes and colonial interventions, parts of the original Inca walls remain standing while later Spanish constructions have crumbled. To Pachacuti, stone was more than survival. It was permanence in an impermanent world. Machu Picchu, a mountain built to move. Perhaps the most iconic legacy of Pachacuti is Machu Picchu, believed to have been built as a royal estate during his reign. Perched atop a narrow ridge between two peaks, the city seems impossibly positioned. Why build there? Modern studies reveal that Machu Picchu sits atop a complex web of geological fractures. These faults provided both challenges and opportunities. They supplied natural drainage paths for rainwater crucial in the humid mountain climate, but they also made the area vulnerable to quakes. And yet, the Inca used the fractures to their advantage. Buildings aligned with fault lines, minimizing strain during movement. Drainage systems followed natural rock channels, preventing flooding and erosion. Terracing not only stabilized slopes, but absorbed vibrations. Machu Picchu, like Cusco, was not a defiance of nature, it was a collaboration. Pachacuti had taken the Inca from a small tribe to a sprawling empire, but his greatest feat may have been psychological. He convinced a people living in one of the world's most earthquake-prone zones that stability was possible not through denial, but through design. But how long could such a delicate balance last? After Pachacuti's death, the Inca Empire would continue to expand. But as new rulers took power and pushed boundaries, would they retain his architectural caution, or would ambition outrun the earth beneath them? What happens when empires forget how to listen to the mountains? You're following the Quijapac Nian, the great Inca road. It winds above cliffs and plunges into valleys. At times, it hugs mountain ridges so narrow that a single misstep sends stones tumbling into the abyss. But the stones that make up the road don't move. They've been here for centuries, despite the shifting earth, the rains, the frost, the empires that have come and gone. You begin to understand why the Spanish were astonished by what they saw, an empire whose roads could outlast its rulers. But beneath this network of stone paths and mighty walls, the earth continued to tremble. In Section 1, we explored how Pachacuti built his empire with both ambition and geological awareness, shaping Cusco and Machu Picchu to withstand a volatile landscape. In this section, we follow what happened next. How did the Inca expand and govern a vast territory laced with seismic instability? And how did the forces of nature, earthquakes, landslides, tremors interact with the forces of empire? What happens when the structures of power are tested, not just by rival nations, but by the earth itself? Tahuantinsuyu expands, roads, stones, and tremors. At its height, the Inca Empire Tahuantinsuyu stretched across 6 modern countries: Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia. It covered deserts, cloud forests, highlands, and coastal plains. But its heart remained in the mountains, and with that came the ever-present risk of seismic disaster. Still, the Inca built. They extended the Quijapac Nian to over 25,000 miles of paved and engineered roads. These were not merely footpaths. Many included retaining walls, staircases carved into rock, and suspension bridges of woven grass that spanned vast chasms. Every step taken along these roads was a step across potential fault lines. To survive here, you didn't just need to build, you needed to build smart. The Inca developed regional strategies to mitigate the danger. Redundant routes. Where a road might be cut off by landslides or quakes, alternate trails were constructed. Tambos, way stations. Built every 10-20 km, these small outposts acted as shelters and supply points. After a quake, they could quickly become centers for aid or reconstruction. Retaining walls and terracing. Across the empire, the Inca used agricultural terracing to stabilize hillsides, reduce erosion, and prevent quake-induced landslides. What's notable is that this massive infrastructure, much of it developed under Pachacuti's successors, reflects a sustained geological literacy. The Inca didn't just inherit Pachacuti's ideas, they institutionalized them. Temples that shook and survived. After Pachacuti, Successive rulers, including Tupac Inca Yupanqui and Huayna Capac, continued to build ceremonial centers in increasingly diverse regions. Some of the most impressive include Ollantay Tambo, a fortress and temple complex perched above the sacred valley. Built with massive boulders, some weighing over 50 tons, its walls show the same precise polygonal masonry that allowed movement without collapse. Vilcashuaman, constructed in a remote highland area, it featured a temple with the characteristic trapezoidal niches and inward-sloping walls. Though damaged by time and later colonists, its earthquake-resistant features remain visible. Chaquiquirao, sometimes called the other Machu Picchu, it sits high above the Apurimac River and required sophisticated terracing to protect against tremors and soil shifting. What ties these places together is a unique balance of imperial ideology and practical engineering. Earthquakes were not viewed as exceptions. They were part of the expected environment. Therefore, temples and palaces were not built with permanence in mind, they were built with resilience. Interestingly, no Inca temples collapsed entirely due to an earthquake in their time, at least not to the point that their religious function failed. This is in sharp contrast to colonial Spanish churches, many of which were destroyed or severely damaged by quakes within decades of being built despite access to more advanced European masonry. The difference: flexibility versus rigidity. The Inca did not try to dominate the earth, they flowed with it. The earth moves, and so do the people. One of the Incas' most overlooked survival strategies was mobility. The empire operated a labor-based economy, known as the Mita, in which people were rotated across regions for construction, farming, or military duty. This meant that after a seismic event, manpower could be quickly redirected. A collapsed terrace slope, a team from a neighboring province would be dispatched. A temple cracked. Specialist masons, often hereditary, were called in to assess and repair. Moreover, records suggest that Inca elites monitored sacred and dangerous locations. Though the empire had no written language in the traditional sense, the Quipu system, knotted cords used to track data, likely recorded disasters, rebuilding efforts, and religious events linked to earthquakes. These were not ignored or forgotten. They were cataloged, analyzed, and responded to. The people, too, responded with rituals. Sacrifices. After a major quake, llamas or other animals were offered to appease Pachamama. Offerings, food, chicha, maize beer, and coca leaves were buried near cracks or landslides. Ceremonial cleaning. Priests might sweep or sprinkle water over temples to purify them from spiritual imbalance. What these actions reveal is a world in which cosmic order and seismic disorder were deeply entangled. Earthquakes were not simply geological, they were moral events, requiring restitution, not repair alone. Foreshocks of collapse. As the 16th century approached, the Inca Empire was stretched to its limits. Internal dissent was rising. Huayna Capac, the last great Sapa Inca, had extended the empire further north, but with greater complexity came greater fragility. Then, sometime around 1525, Huayna Capac died, likely of smallpox introduced by Europeans who had landed on the coast. His death sparked a succession crisis between his sons Atahualpa and Huascar, plunging the empire into a brutal civil war. And during this time, the earth shook again. Spanish chroniclers, many hostile to the Inca, mention a series of earthquakes and omens during the lead-up to the conquest. Whether these were truly natural events or narrative inventions is unclear, but to the Inca, they were seen as signs. The gods were unsettled, the world was off balance. In Cusco, reports of a mysterious glowing in the sky, trembling hills, and animal unrest circulated. Priests were said to perform frantic rituals. Atahualpa, victorious over his brother, was in Cajamarca, far from the heart of the empire, when he encountered a man named Francisco Pizarro. The Spaniards came with guns and horses, But the Inca met them with a belief that the world was already being shaken not just by invaders, but by deeper cosmic forces. The question was no longer whether the earth would move. It was whether the empire could hold when it did. What was it that finally broke the Inca Empire's steel and disease, or something more ancient beneath their feet? You are standing in Cusco, but it is no longer the Cusco of Pachacuti. It is 1533, and Spanish banners hang over temples now called churches. The smell of muskets and unfamiliar leather mixes with the old scent of smoke and stone. In the central plaza, stones have been pulled from ancient walls and reassembled under European arches. But the ground beneath is unchanged. It still shifts. It still groans. It still remembers. The collapse of the Inca Empire has often been told as a swift and decisive conquest. A few hundred Spaniards defeat an army of millions. But the truth, like the Andes themselves, is layered and faulted. The fall was not only caused by swords, but also by uncertainty, both political and geological. In this final section, we will follow the intertwined decline of the Inca state and the role that earthquakes real and symbolic played in its unraveling. We will also explore the long aftershocks, both literal and cultural, that continued well into the colonial era. The final faults of the empire. When Francisco Pizarro and his men met Atahualpa in Cajamarca in 1532, the Inca Empire was already weakened by years of civil war, plague, and logistical overextension. But Spanish accounts, even if filtered through conquest narratives, make frequent mention of earthquakes, landslides, and omens that plagued the region before and during their campaign. In Inca cosmology, the world was governed by cycles of creation and destruction known as Pachacuti, a term that, interestingly, was also the name of the great reforming emperor, Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui. His name literally means he who overturned space and time. And perhaps fittingly, the end of the empire bore the same features as its mythic rebirth: upheaval, rupture, change. Chroniclers such as Pedro Cieza de Leon and Garcilaso de la Vega, a mestizo born of a Spanish father and Inca noblewoman, speak of strange happenings. Animals howling in daylight, trembling hills in the sacred valley, cracks opening on ceremonial sites, unseasonal thunder and lightning. Whether these were actual earthquakes or metaphorical descriptions is impossible to know with certainty. But for the Inca, whose worldview entwined the physical and spiritual realms, such events would not have been separated. The land was speaking, and its message was one of disruption. Cusco, despite its famed stonework, was not invincible. In the years following Spanish occupation, colonial structures often built atop Inca foundations suffered repeated collapses due to seismic activity. Spanish builders often disregarded Inca construction wisdom, favoring their own European styles, which were rigid, vertically heavy, and poorly suited to the Andes. The result? In 1650, a massive earthquake devastated Cusco. Spanish churches crumbled, walls buckled, but Inca walls, especially those with trapezoidal windows and interlocking stones, remained standing. Again and again, earthquakes would reveal a silent truth: the older stones were better suited to this restless land. From resistance to memory. Even after the empire's political fall, the Andes did not stop quaking, and the memory of Inca resilience did not disappear. In Vilcabamba, a remote mountainous region, the last Inca rulers held out until 1572. They established a neo-Inca state, preserving rituals, stonework, and resistance for decades after Cusco had fallen. Earthquakes continued to strike, some recorded by Spanish governors, others preserved in oral traditions. These tales became part of Andean folklore. Stories of temples protected by stone serpents that could sense earth tremors. Legends of Apis, mountain spirits who shifted when angry. Beliefs that earthquakes were a punishment for failing to honor Pachamama. In these stories, we find a continuation of what Pachacuti began: a worldview in which the Earth is not inert, but aware. What the Spanish misunderstood and what the Inca lived by was that living on a fault line requires more than engineering. It demands humility. The Inca did not attempt to control the Andes. They negotiated with them. They listened to them. They shaped their homes, their cities, and their beliefs around the idea that movement was inevitable. Lessons from the stones. Centuries have passed, but the Andes remain the same: tall, wild, unpredictable. Today, Peru and its neighboring nations continue to face seismic threats. Cusco and Lima lie in active earthquake zones. Modern engineers now incorporate shock-absorbing materials and early warning systems into their buildings. Yet when earthquakes strike, one often finds that Inca walls endure, while more recent constructions do not. The Coricancha in Cusco still shows Inca foundations beneath colonial cloisters. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman remains largely intact, despite centuries of seismic strain. Ollantaytambo's agricultural terraces still hold back unstable slopes, just as they did 500 years ago. What is remarkable is not that these stones have survived. It's how they survived through a philosophy of adaptation, not resistance. Even now, archaeologists and engineers study Inca masonry, searching for lost techniques. Some answers are known: angled stones, flexible joints, deep foundations. Others remain mysteries. How did they transport such massive stones? How did they decide where to build? What knowledge has been lost in the cracks? But perhaps the most valuable lesson is not technical, it's cultural. To build in a seismic zone is to build with the expectation of failure, not total collapse, but adjustment, repair, evolution. The Inca did not believe in permanence. They believed in balance. When the earth moved, they moved with it. The empire beneath the earth. If you walk through Cusco today, you'll see tourists gazing at the massive stones of Hatten-Rumiak Street, tracing their fingers along the 12-angled stone, marveling at its precision. Children pass by without looking. They've grown up with it. Above these stones, colonial balconies lean outward. Over them, electrical wires sag. And beneath them all, the earth still shifts. But the Inca foundations remain. In that persistence, something powerful endures. Not the empire, not the name, not even the language in many places, but the relationship with the land complex. Respectful, watchful remains buried in the stones. Perhaps this is Pachacuti's final gamble, not in battle, not in architecture, but in memory. He built for an empire that he knew might one day fall, but he built in such a way that the earth itself would remember the people who once listened to its tremors. Story 3. When the Nile trembled, earthquakes in ancient Egypt. You stand on the banks of the Nile. The water is slow and wide, the sky a burnished copper. Papyrus rustles at the edge of the river, and beyond the green floodplain, the desert rises like an eternal wall. The stones of ancient temples burn warm under the sun. To the untrained eye, this is a land of stillness, where time is measured not in days or years, but in dynasties. But what if the earth here was never truly still? Ancient Egypt, renowned for its pyramids, mummies, and myths, rarely appears in histories of seismic disaster. Its story is one of continuity, not collapse, of unshaken permanence. Yet the geological truth is more complicated. Egypt is not among the most earthquake-prone regions in the world, but tremors have occurred here for millennia. And the people who built colossal monuments and carefully balanced cosmic order were not unaware of the Earth's restlessness. In this section, we explore how Egyptians perceived, responded to, and sometimes ignored the quakes that did rattle their temples and palaces. It's a story hidden in cracked obelisks, collapsed columns, and forgotten hieroglyphs where silence does not mean absence, only a different kind of memory. The geography of perceived permanence. Egypt sits on the Nubian plate, largely removed from the direct tectonic collisions that plague places like the Andes or Anatolia. But just to the east lies the Red Sea Rift, and to the northeast, the Dead Sea transform fault both active systems. The Eastern Desert, Sinai Peninsula, and parts of Lower Egypt have long been seismically vulnerable, particularly along fault lines near the Gulf of Suez and the Eastern Mediterranean. Most tremors were minor, and ancient Egypt's relatively flexible mudbrick housing likely absorbed these shocks with little consequence. But the story changes when we look at the monumental stone architecture of temples, obelisks, and pyramid structures meant not just to endure, but to defy time. Archaeological and geological evidence suggests that several significant earthquake events did impact key locations. They were not frequent, but they were deeply symbolic in a culture where stability was sacred. Sacred spaces and subtle shift. Take Karnak, the sprawling temple complex in Thebes, modern Luxor. Dedicated to Amun-Ra and expanded over centuries, it contains vast courtyards, colossal statues, and the famous Great Hypostyle Hall, 134 massive sandstone columns, rising like stone papyrus stalks toward the heavens. Today you can see signs of structural misalignment. Columns tilt. Architraves, the stone beams resting atop columns, have cracked or fallen. Some of this damage results from time, flood, and human activity, but others bear the hallmarks of seismic force. Recent geoarchaeological studies have proposed that a local earthquake, likely between the 4th and 1st centuries BCE, caused partial collapses within Karnak and neighboring Luxor Temple. Repair efforts seen in hasty masonry patches and reset columns suggest that temple priests and royal builders knew how to stabilize, but not necessarily why things had shifted. What did they think had happened? In a society governed by divine balance, Maat's sudden, unexplained destruction would have been terrifying. Egyptian religion emphasized cosmic order upheld by gods and pharaohs alike. A cracked column or fallen statue was not just a material failure, it was a theological problem. But unlike other ancient cultures, the Egyptians rarely recorded natural disasters directly. Earthquakes, if acknowledged at all, were described in vague terms. The land shook. The heavens roared. The gods were displeased. These phrases occur sporadically in stelae and temple inscriptions, often associated with omens or times of political instability. Did the earth literally tremble? Possibly, but the language of instability was as much symbolic as geological. Pyramids and earthquake engineering. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom, especially those at Giza, are often cited as the most enduring human constructions. They have withstood 4,500 years of floods, looting, erosion, and yes, likely a few earthquakes. Curiously, they have survived in part because of their very design. The massive weight of the pyramids and their wide base distribute stress efficiently. Their orientation and internal structure, core, stones, passageways, and relieving chambers provide redundancy. While ancient Egyptian builders probably weren't designing for quakes, they built with geological intuition. That said, not all pyramids fared equally. The bent pyramid at Dashur, built by Sneferu in the 26th century BCE, shows early signs of architectural adjustment. Its angle changes midway up, likely due to foundational instability. Whether that instability was seismic or subsidence-related is debated, but the willingness to change mid-project reflects adaptive thinking. Further south, at Abydos and Elephantine Island, temple ruins show signs of quake-related damage: split columns, offset doorways, misaligned stone blocks. These are not dramatic, city-leveling quakes, but rather gradual reminders that the earth was not as still as it appeared. The silence of the scribes. One of the most frustrating puzzles in studying seismic history in ancient Egypt is the lack of clear textual evidence. Compared to Mesopotamia, where records of earthquakes exist on cuneiform tablets, Egyptian sources are maddeningly quiet. Why? A few possibilities emerge. Cultural framing. Egyptians may have seen earthquakes not as discrete natural phenomena, but as manifestations of divine will. There was no need to explain them geologically. Rarity, earthquakes large enough to disrupt society were infrequent. Daily life was more affected by the Nile's flood cycle, which shaped agriculture, religion, and survival. Political control. Pharaohs projected stability. Acknowledging environmental chaos could be seen as an admission of cosmic failure, a threat to legitimacy. Yet there are hints. A stele from the reign of Ramesses II describes the destruction of a temple roof as a divine warning. In the Demotic Chronicle, composed in the late 1st millennium BCE, certain omens mention the earth shaking as a sign of dynastic change. Greek and Roman writers like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, observing Egypt under the Ptolemies, mention quaking ground and temple damage during their visits, suggesting that seismic events occurred, even if Egyptians themselves refrained from recording them directly. The truth may be buried in the sand, not absent, just obscured. An earthquake under empire. By the time Egypt fell under Persian, then Greek, then Roman control, seismic awareness became slightly more visible, though still filtered through religious lenses. During the Ptolemaic period, 305–30 BCE, Alexandria became a center of scholarship. Greek geographers and naturalists studied Egypt's geography in ways native scribes never had. And Alexandria itself, a coastal city near the Mediterranean fault zone, was not immune to seismic activity. In 365 CE, a massive earthquake and tsunami struck the eastern Mediterranean, devastating Crete and affecting the Egyptian coast. Ancient sources claim Alexandria suffered damage, and some scholars believe this event contributed to the decline of the Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. If Egypt seemed immovable before, that illusion was now beginning to crack. So what does it mean that a civilization so obsessed with eternal order lived on ground that could occasionally betray them? What happens when a culture built to last forever is reminded that even stone can shift? You walk through the ruins of Luxor Temple, a place once alive with incense, chants, and the thud of processional drums. The columns soar skyward, the hieroglyphs speak of divine power and eternal rule, but here and there a misaligned base, a cracked lintel, a subtle lean tell a quieter story. The temple may appear timeless, but it has not stood untouched. The ground moved, and so did history. In Section 1, we explored the subtle but real seismic risks that shaped, however quietly, ancient Egypt's monumental past. Now, we delve into the cultural consequences of these movements, how the Egyptians absorbed tremors into their worldview, how they responded when temples cracked, and what those responses reveal about their perception of both the divine and the physical world. This is not a tale of sudden cataclysm, but of symbolic fragility in a society obsessed with eternal order. A religion of balance. At the core of ancient Egyptian belief was the concept of Ma'at, cosmic order, justice, truth, and stability. The pharaoh was the living embodiment of this order, tasked with maintaining balance between the forces of chaos and harmony. Floods were measured, harvests timed, and rituals performed to renew Ma'at constantly. Earthquakes, though rare, would have been seen through this metaphysical lens. They were not random geological acts. They were disturbances in the cosmic equilibrium, signs that Ma'at had been disrupted. And yet, unlike Mesopotamian or Greek cultures, the Egyptians did not externalize the source of these disruptions in their records. You do not find tales of Poseidon striking the earth, or of gods hurling lightning in rage. Instead, the focus remains on the response rituals to restore harmony, not stories to assign blame. This silence is telling. When a column fell, when a temple cracked, it was not narrated in myths but absorbed into ritual. In the event of structural damage, priests might rededicate a site, offer new sacrifices, or reorient temple processions. Restoration work often blended seamlessly into the sacred architecture, making it hard for modern scholars to even determine what was rebuilt after damage and what was part of the original plan. The emphasis was always the same: restore what had been disturbed, not just physically but spiritually. Restoration as ritual. Throughout Egypt's long dynastic history, temples were continually rebuilt, restored, and expanded. But these efforts were not just about aging stone or dynastic vanity. Some followed events we now believe were triggered by earthquakes or earth instability. Take the Temple of Ptah at Memphis. Archaeological surveys have shown evidence of subsidence and partial collapse, followed by hurried but careful rebuilding. The style and materials suggest that these reconstructions were not just functional, they were ceremonial acts of reconsecration. A similar pattern appears in Abydos, a major cult center of Osiris, god of the underworld. Parts of the Temple of Seti show signs of unusual foundational shifts, suggesting a ground movement or tremor during or after construction. Yet rather than abandon the site, the temple was reworked, reinscribed, and folded into ongoing religious practices. In fact, many temples show layers of occupation: stone reused, reconfigured, resanctified, often without inscriptional comment on why such rebuilding occurred. This implies that restoration was not seen as a break from the past, but a continuation of sacred duty. To repair was to renew. In this way, the Egyptians handled earthquakes not through documentation, but through continuity. Rulers and the politics of repair. Pharaohs seized opportunities to link themselves to sacred rebuilding. In doing so, they subtly acknowledged instability while reinforcing their authority. During the reign of Ramesses III, c. 1186–1155 BCE, Egypt faced numerous crises: invasions by the Sea Peoples, economic strain, and possible environmental upheaval. While no direct record of an earthquake from his reign survives, archaeological damage to key sites, including Karnak and Medinet Habu, suggests that tremors or geological shifts may have occurred. Ramesses III took great care to record his building and restoration efforts, portraying himself as the upholder of Ma'at in a time of chaos. The language is formulaic: I have rebuilt what was fallen. I have made it greater than it was before, but the political message is clear. The king holds the power to fix what the earth or enemies have broken. This framing recurs throughout later periods, especially under the Sate dynasty, 26th dynasty, c. 664–525 BCE, when rulers like Psamtik I and Necho II undertook temple restorations during a time of political revival. These rulers often worked on ancient sites that had been damaged possibly by tremors, flooding, or neglect, and used the act of rebuilding to legitimize their rule through sacred continuity. But this strategy had limits. When the damage became too extensive, and when Ma'at seemed truly disturbed, the silence grew heavier. When the gods fell silent. One of the most remarkable shifts in Egyptian culture came during the late period and the Ptolemaic era, when foreign rule coincided with growing instability, both human and environmental. During this time, Egypt's seismic history becomes slightly more visible not in Egyptian records, but in Greek and Roman sources. The geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes temples in ruin in Upper Egypt, possibly from earthquakes. The philosopher Plutarch mentions that the Nile changed its course, in reference to certain temple sites, possibly the result of seismic activity or localized collapses of riverbanks. Later Roman texts refer to tremors in Alexandria, which, while a coastal city, was nonetheless affected by faults near the eastern Mediterranean. Perhaps the most haunting record, though, is the lack of restoration in these later periods. As Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, temple rebuilding slowed. Priestly institutions lost state support. Sacred knowledge began to fade. And when earthquakes struck like the devastating 365 CE quake and tsunami that affected the Nile Delta and Alexandria, no one rebuilt the shrines in the old ways. The gods, once present in every brick and obelisk, seemed to grow distant. The old rituals still carried on in some places, but the sense of control of being able to re-establish Ma'at through temple repair was weakening. By the time Christianity spread through Egypt in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, many temples were closed or repurposed. Earthquakes continued to shake the region sporadically, but no one turned to Amun or Osiris for explanations. The symbols of stability columns, hieroglyphs, sacred walls now crumbled without response. The age of restoration had ended. Stone memory and modern echoes. Today, Egypt is not known as an earthquake-prone country, but tremors still occur, and occasionally they are strong enough to cause damage. In 1992, a 5.9 magnitude earthquake struck near Cairo, killing over 500 people and damaging historic structures including parts of ancient buildings long believed impervious. That quake served as a stark reminder that even the land of permanence is not immune to impermanence. And yet, the ancient stonework, especially in places like Karnak, Luxor, and Giza, still demonstrates remarkable resilience. Though designed for ritual and grandeur, many temples exhibit features that allowed them to absorb minor seismic movement. Massive block construction using dense sandstone or limestone. Battered sloping walls, which reduce vertical stress and resist toppling. Modular design, allowing damaged sections to be rebuilt without disturbing the whole. Whether intentional or accidental, these features preserved Egypt's sacred landscape longer than most civilizations could dream. But the question remains, did the Egyptians ever truly understand the Earth's restlessness? Or did they, in their quest for eternity, choose to ignore the quiet rumble beneath their feet? You move through the ruins of Abydos, where the Temple of Seti rises out of sand and silence. The walls are still painted with ochre and cobalt blue, the gods still march in procession, and hieroglyphs still speak praises of a pharaoh long returned to dust. And yet the ground beneath your feet feels uneven. Here, the stones tell more than one story of faith, of art, and of shifts, both spiritual and geological. In Section 1, we trace the subtle and sometimes hidden signs of seismic activity in ancient Egypt. In Section 2, we explored how the Egyptian worldview framed and absorbed these events, using ritual, restoration, and political narrative to preserve Ma'at in the face of trembling ground. Now, in this final section, we draw together the threads. What did earthquakes mean for a civilization obsessed with permanence? How did the experience of ground movement echo through their rituals, their silence, and their legacy? And what might we learn today from how the Egyptians negotiated instability in a world that demanded stability? Eternity as architecture. Ancient Egypt was built on the assumption that things could last forever. The afterlife was not a vague spiritual state, but a physical continuity. The dead needed food, clothes, statues, tombs. The gods needed temples, offerings, and songs. Material preservation was inseparable from spiritual existence. This ideology drove everything from the care taken in carving hieroglyphs into granite to the orientation of pyramids towards celestial markers. But it also created a tension. Because in a land where things were supposed to last forever, even a single crack in a sacred wall was not merely structural, it was existential. The paradox of Egypt was this. It saw itself as eternal, but it lived on ground that moved slowly and silently. The great stone complexes Karnak, Luxor, Philae, Edfu were vulnerable to the same tectonic rhythms that affected Greece, Mesopotamia, and the Red Sea coast. And while Egypt may have experienced fewer catastrophic quakes, it was not immune. The civilization that built to resist time also had to adapt to interruption. Their answer was not engineering per se, it was ritual continuity. Temples were not abandoned when damaged. They were repaired, extended, overbuilt. The act of rebuilding was itself a renewal of cosmic order. Each time a column fell or a pylon cracked, the pharaoh, or priesthood, could reaffirm their role as guardian of balance by restoring it. The stone was not sacred because it could not break. It was sacred because it could be re-sanctified. The aftershock of silence. By the later periods of Egyptian history under Persian, Greek, and Roman rule, earthquakes began to show up more clearly in historical records, though not from Egyptians themselves. The 365 CE Mediterranean tsunami, triggered by a massive undersea earthquake near Crete, struck the coast of Egypt, damaging Alexandria and perhaps other Nile Delta settlements. By then, Christianity had taken hold, and the theological framework of man had been replaced with different ideas of divine causality. Temples were closed or destroyed, and Egypt's ancient religion faded from public life. With it, the old response to earthquakes, the ritual rebalancing of space and meaning, also disappeared. And yet the monuments remained. Today, when we visit Egypt's ancient sites, we see a patchwork of precision and disruption. A fallen obelisk lies beside its still-standing twin. A statue's head sits half-buried beside a column that still casts shadow at noon. These sites appear ruined to us, but to the Egyptians, they were never finished. Restoration was not an act of nostalgia. It was part of the sacred process. But once the ritual stopped, the stones became quiet. In that silence, we hear something else. The voice of impermanence, echoing through a civilization that tried so hard to deny it. Modern earthquakes, ancient lessons. In the 20th and 21st centuries, earthquakes have returned to Egypt's awareness not as religious omens, but as urban risks. In 1992, a moderate quake near Cairo killed hundreds and damaged several historic mosques and buildings. In 2023, seismic activity near the Gulf of Aqaba caused minor tremors in Sinai and the eastern Red Sea region. And across the border, major quakes in Turkey, Syria, and the Mediterranean basin have raised concerns about Egypt's preparedness, especially for vulnerable structures in historic districts and informal housing developments. And yet, even as modern engineers debate seismic codes, ancient sites like Karnak, Luxor, and the pyramids continue to endure. Why? Because the ancient builders, guided by religious and intuitive understanding, created flexible monumentalism. Their stone joints, battered walls, and massive foundations allowed movement without collapse. They did not fight the earth's shifts, they worked within them. In this, the Egyptians, like the Inca, like the Greeks of Delphi, understood something crucial: that resilience matters more than resistance, that adapting to the earth is wiser than pretending it stands still. Echoes beneath the sand. In the end, earthquakes in Egypt were rare but meaningful. They arrived quietly, cracked a temple roof, tipped a column, and then receded, leaving behind questions that the Egyptians answered not with science, but with ceremony. And perhaps that is why the monuments still stand not untouched, but honestly marked by time. So if you find yourself walking through Karnak or standing beside the collapsed obelisk of Hatshepsut, look closely. Look at the shifted joints, the reset blocks, the places where stone meets stone with just enough give. That's not decay, that's memory. It's a record not of defeat, but of endurance. A recognition that even in a land where eternity was carved into stone, the earth was always ready to remind them otherwise. Story 4. The Forgotten Shutters of Rome, Seismic Life in the Eternal City. You are standing in the Roman Forum beneath the shadow of the Temple of Saturn, where the worn columns still rise into the Italian sky. The sound of traffic echoes faintly in the distance, but here, surrounded by ruined basilicas and triumphal arches, time seems strangely still. You feel the solidity of marble, the weight of empire embedded in stone. Rome was built to last, but it wasn't built on still ground. Despite its name, the Eternal City was never immune to the shifting earth. Beneath the carefully measured blocks, the grooved paving stones, and the whispering walls of its ancient monuments lies a tectonic fault system that has shaped its history, often silently, sometimes violently. In this first section, we begin to unearth a lesser-known truth, that earthquakes did occur in ancient Rome, and while they were not the most destructive natural force the city faced, they were disruptive, disorienting, and deeply meaningful in a culture obsessed with signs, omens, and order. Rome was not just an empire of power and conquest. It was a city of planners, architects, and augurs, people who believed that nothing significant happened without divine cause. When the earth moved, Romans did not always rebuild. Sometimes they sacrificed, sometimes they fled, and sometimes they ignored it entirely. But the stones still shifted, and those shifts left traces. The geology of the Tiber Valley. Modern geologists categorize Rome as a region of moderate seismic risk, sitting near the boundary of the Apennine seismic belt, a region prone to thrust fault quakes. The Alban Hills, southeast of the city, are remnants of ancient volcanic activity, and fault lines run under and near the Tiber Valley. Today, earthquakes are more commonly associated with central Italy, Umbria, L'Aquila, and the Apennines, but the area around Rome is not quiet. Several earthquakes since antiquity have caused damage within the city, though few have been catastrophic. This quiet does not mean absence. It means occasional disruption, enough to crack walls, shift foundations, and most importantly for the Romans send a message from the gods. For a society that built in stone and governed by omens, even a minor tremor carried weight. The early republic, signs and portents. In the earliest centuries of Roman history, the days of kings, myth, and founding heroes, earthquakes were recorded not as geological events, but as divine communications. The Annals Maximi, Rome's earliest historical records kept by the pontifices, high priests, occasionally mention tremors as part of a larger list of omens, eclipses, comets, monstrous births. A quake might be listed simply as terri modus, the ground moved. But such an entry was significant. A small earthquake in 464 BCE, for instance, is recorded alongside a plague and military loss, all interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. Later, the historian Livy would refer to earthquakes in his sweeping Ob Urb Candida not for their physical destruction, but for the religious panic they caused. If the earth moved during a Senate meeting or a military campaign, it could halt proceedings entirely. Sacrifices would be performed, festivals postponed, laws delayed. Even the most practical of Roman institutions, their law courts, could be upended by a quake seen as inauspicious. In this way, the seismic life of Rome was never just structural, it was spiritual. Temples and tremors. Though the Roman ideal was order and symmetry, their temples sometimes bore signs of uneven foundations, later retrofitted with buttresses, drains, or plinths. Some of these modifications hint at subtle ground movements, possibly from minor quakes or subsidence. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, perched on the Capitoline Hill and considered Rome's holiest site, was damaged and rebuilt several times. While most accounts attribute its destruction to fire and civil unrest, structural shifts in the hilltop's foundation suggest tectonic movement may have played a role, especially in the earliest collapses, when wood and stone gave way together. More definitively, the Pantheon, originally constructed by Agrippa and rebuilt under Hadrian, shows signs of stress fractures in its rotunda that are aligned with seismic fault patterns. Later medieval repairs attempted to address cracking that likely began with minor quakes. In the Colosseum, repairs made after earthquakes in 443 and 484 CE, as recorded in later chronicles, focused on the outer walls. Damage patterns here reflect ground movement rather than fire or war. And in Ostia Antiqua, Rome's port city, several insulae, apartment buildings, and warehouses show cracked masonry and shifted tilework inconsistent with age alone, offering rare physical evidence of quake damage in a region not typically remembered for shaking. The people's reaction. How did ordinary Romans respond to earthquakes? Surprisingly, they were less focused on rebuilding and more on reinterpreting meaning. Earthquakes were often grouped into a class of signs called prodigia, unnatural or frightening events that called for interpretation and ritual correction. After a quake, the Senate might consult the haruspices priests who read the livers of sacrificed animals or the Sibylline books, a collection of oracles consulted only in dire times. Typical responses to an earthquake might include public sacrifices, particularly of unblemished animals, ritual purification of temples or entire neighborhoods, temporary closure of political forums or theaters, in rare cases, expiatory games or days of mourning. Strikingly, Romans rarely recorded reconstruction after quakes unless the damage was extensive. Unlike in Egypt or the Inca world, where rebuilding was seen as a spiritual duty, Roman resilience often meant continuity of function, not architectural perfection. A cracked temple column might be left standing if the god remained appeased. Yet the symbolism of collapse lingered. A damaged statue of a god could be interpreted as a withdrawal of favor. A shifting floor in a basilica might inspire rumors of impending doom. Earthquakes made the unseen world suddenly visible, if only for a moment. Late Empire and the quake of 443 CE. One of the most significant earthquakes in late Roman history occurred in 443 CE, during the reign of Emperor Valentinian III. Chroniclers describe a powerful tremor that struck Rome and surrounding regions, causing damage to aqueducts, baths, and parts of the Aurelian walls. Though details are sparse, later Christian historians saw the quake as a moral judgment, a sign of Rome's spiritual decay, as pagan traditions gave way to a Christianized empire, struggling with internal strife and barbarian threats. The response was primarily theological: prayers, fasting, and sermons. Little is said of rebuilding. The event was remembered not for its destruction but for its warning. And perhaps this is the most Roman response of all. When the ground moved, the Romans didn't rebuild to outlast it. They looked upward, or inward. They interpreted, appeased, and moved on. Stone could crack, cities could fall, but so long as the rituals continued and the signs were read, the world could be rebalanced. Yet a question lingers in the marble dust. Did the Romans, so focused on the heavens and the omens in animals and stars, ever fully grasp what lay beneath their feet? What happens to an empire that watches the skies, but forgets to listen to the ground? You walk now along the Via Appia, Rome's ancient highway. The stones underfoot are smooth, dark, and uneven, not from poor construction but from time, and perhaps from the occasional tremor. To the modern traveler, the Appian Way appears unchanging, winding past aqueducts, tombs, and low hills. But Roman roads, like their buildings, have endured not because the earth was stable, but because the Romans responded to its instability with infrastructure, ritual, and at times denial. In Section 1, we explored how the Romans saw earthquakes less as natural events and more as divine omens, prodigia requiring interpretation, not engineering solutions. Now, in Section 2, we look deeper into the political, religious, and structural responses to earthquakes across the Roman world, especially during the imperial era. What did emperors do when the ground moved? How did provinces, spread across a vast and geologically diverse empire, experience and react to seismic events? And what can the scars left in temples, theaters, and bathhouses tell us about the resilience and fragility of the Roman world? Rome as the unshakable center. The ideology of Rome was built on permanence. The city was the caput mundi, the head of the world. Its myths were filled with images of divine favor: Romulus receiving the augury of the vultures, Jupiter's thunderbolts marking divine approval, the Sibylline books guiding Rome through plague and war. In such a worldview, a shaking earth beneath the city was deeply unsettling. It did not just threaten infrastructure, it questioned divine favor. While the Republican period was more likely to treat quakes as omens and pause public activity, by the imperial era, emperors began to use seismic events as opportunities for public legitimacy. When the ground moved, the emperor could step in as the restorer of order, not just by rebuilding, but by interpreting the event, performing rituals, and reminding the people that Rome would endure. Consider Emperor Augustus, the architect of Rome's first great imperial rebuilding project. Though no major earthquakes are recorded in Rome during his reign, the language of his res gesti, things accomplished, reflects the mindset of a ruler who saw himself as bringing stability to a world on the brink of chaos. Had a major quake occurred, it would likely have been woven into this narrative: Rome shaken, Augustus steady. Later emperors, including Tiberius, Domitian, and Antoninus Pius, are known to have funded reconstruction in earthquake-hit provinces, not because they were personally responsible, but because their imperial role demanded the restoration of order. Provincial earthquakes, when the ground betrayed the empire. Outside the city of Rome, the empire encompassed a wide range of seismically active regions: Asia Minor, Greece, Syria, North Africa, and parts of Hispania. Earthquakes were more frequent and sometimes catastrophic. These provincial quakes were often chronicled not in Rome, but by Greek and Eastern historians, or through epigraphic evidence, stone inscriptions commemorating aid, rebuilding, or imperial generosity. One of the most striking examples is the earthquake of 17 CE, which devastated at least 12 cities in the Roman province of Asia, modern-day Western Turkey, including Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Roman historian Tacitus records the event in his annals. In the same year, 12 famous cities of Asia fell in ruins from an earthquake, and the distress was the more terrible as the calamity occurred without a moment's warning. Annals 2.47. In response, Tiberius offered 5 years tax relief for affected cities, subsidies for rebuilding, direct imperial involvement in reconstruction. This was not purely altruism. Earthquakes provided emperors with a rare chance to appear both benevolent and powerful. Rebuilding temples, streets, and agoras gave visible proof of imperial presence and divine favor restored. Epigraphs from Sardis praised Tiberius as a new founder of the city. The emperor's name was carved into stones alongside that of Zeus and Apollo. Earthquakes, it seems, created political tremors as well, allowing the emperor to reassert control, not just over land, but over meaning. Seismic politics and imperial image. Another significant quake struck Pompeii in 62 CE, 17 years before the infamous eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. This quake, estimated at magnitude 5.6, caused major damage across the city. Temples were damaged, including that of Venus Pompeiana, the city's patron. Several public baths, forums, and homes were left in ruins. Rebuilding efforts were still underway when Vesuvius erupted. The Roman reaction, again, focused not on geological understanding, but on ritual and civic renewal. Emperor Nero, who ruled at the time, sent aid and may have used the rebuilding effort to curry favor with elites. Public inscriptions emphasized restoration, not fear. The amphitheater of Pompeii was being repaired, temples reconsecrated, statues re-erected. Interestingly, archaeological studies revealed different building techniques after the quake: fewer elaborate frescoes, more concrete, cheaper materials. In other words, Rome's imperial ideology of recovery was not always matched by local economic capacity. And still, no contemporary Roman source connects the quake of 62 with any concern about future disaster. The idea that the earth might strike again, or worse, was not part of the narrative. There was no geological awareness, no evacuation plans, no reconsideration of Pompeii's location. Rome, even at the edge of empire, assumed its own endurance. Temples, theaters, and earthquake engineering. While Rome never developed a scientific understanding of earthquakes, Roman architects unintentionally created structures that could survive moderate tremors. Some key features. Flexible masonry techniques. Roman concrete opus cementitium was more flexible than cut stone, able to absorb small shifts. Wide foundations. Temples and large public buildings often had deep foundations that reduced the impact of shaking. Arches and vaults. These distributed weight more evenly, minimizing collapse. However, these were not designed with earthquakes in mind. They were primarily aesthetic and structural preferences. When larger quakes struck, especially in eastern provinces, buildings often collapsed entirely. In Antioch, a city in modern-day Turkey, several quakes occurred over the centuries. The 526 CE earthquake during the Byzantine period is one of the most deadly on record, killing over 250,000. But even in earlier Roman times, smaller quakes damaged bathhouses, forums, and palaces. Roman response, largely symbolic. Games were held to appease the gods. New temples were consecrated. The emperor's image was reinscribed as a restorer. Concrete cracked, but the imperial narrative held firm. Rome's last tremors. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, as the Western Roman Empire faltered, earthquakes continued, but now with Christian overtones. Pagan omens gave way to Christian sermons warning of judgment. An earthquake in Rome in 443 CE, likely moderate in strength, was interpreted by Christian leaders as a sign of divine displeasure. Bishops called for penance and almsgiving, not sacrifices to Jupiter. The physical response to quakes remained minimal, but the spiritual framework had changed. And yet the city of Rome, cracked and crumbling, still stood. The stones bore stress fractures, columns leaned, roads twisted slightly where the earth had shifted, but as long as rituals, pagan or Christian, continued, the illusion of permanence endured. And so we ask, was the greatness of Rome built on stone and ritual alone? Or did its strength lie in the stories it told after the ground had moved? You are standing on the Palatine Hill, once the seat of emperors, now a place of silence and weeds growing between cracked foundations. The remains of imperial palaces sprawl outward in broken corridors, marble walls reduced to outlines. Here, where once decisions that shaped the ancient world were made, you hear only the distant rumble of footsteps and the occasional murmur of wind between arches. And deep beneath all this, fault lines still shift, slow and unnoticed. In Section 1, we examine how early Romans interpreted earthquakes as omens, rather than geological events. In Section 2, we explored how the imperial state responded to quakes across its vast domain, often with rituals and reconstruction designed to reinforce authority more than mitigate risk. Now, in this final section, we consider what earthquakes reveal about the limits of Rome's permanence, how shifting ground mirrored a shifting empire, and how memory carved into marble and myth still shapes our perception of Roman resilience. Because Rome did not fall in a single earthquake, nor did it shatter like Pompeii beneath a mountain, but tremors, both literal and symbolic, ran through it, weakening its foundations long before the final collapse. Seismic decay, an imperial illusion. By the 4th century CE, Rome was no longer the center of imperial power. The capital had shifted first to Milan, then to Constantinople. The Eternal City was still sacred, still symbolic, but it was also crumbling. Earthquakes during this period struck not just buildings, but ideas. A tremor in 363 CE, during the reign of Emperor Julian the Apostate, was interpreted as a divine warning. Julian had attempted to revive pagan worship in a Christianizing empire, and the quake that struck Antioch during his campaign was seen by Christians as proof that the old gods were powerless. Pagan temples were shaken. Statues fell. Whether the damage was severe or symbolic, the earthquake became part of a narrative of decline. In Rome, similar signs emerged. The Temple of Serapis, imported from Egypt and once a sign of imperial syncretism, was heavily damaged, likely by a combination of earthquakes, neglect, and intentional Christian destruction. Meanwhile, repairs to older temples ceased. Porticos once carefully maintained were left to crack and collapse. Earthquakes may have helped accelerate what ideology had already begun. Even imperial buildings, the Baths of Caracalla, the Aurelian Walls, the Forum of Trajan, suffered damage in later centuries. As funds dried up and skilled labor disappeared, restoration slowed, and the city's once proud infrastructure began to show the weight of both time and tremor. The empire was no longer capable of holding everything together, not spiritually, not politically, and increasingly not physically. Christianity and the new interpretation of disaster. As Christianity rose to dominance, the Roman interpretation of earthquakes shifted from prodigum to divine punishment. No longer were tremors read as signals from a pantheon of competing gods. Now they were part of biblical cosmology linked to sin, judgment, or the approach of apocalypse. Earthquakes featured prominently in Christian eschatology, from the book of Revelation to sermons by church fathers who interpreted shaking ground as God's voice. In 447 CE, an earthquake struck Constantinople, then the eastern heart of the Roman Empire. Citizens marched in processions, praying for mercy. Hymns were sung in the streets. Bishops led chants. There was no mention of auguries or haruspices or the Sibylline books. The old responses had been abandoned. Yet the underlying impulse remained. Interpret the tremor, respond with ritual, restore order. But this time, there was no empire left in Rome strong enough to rebuild what had cracked. The old stone structures began to fall out of use, and many, like the Colosseum, became quarries, their stones repurposed for churches, palaces, or city walls. The once grand architecture of permanence became rubble, material for survival. Even the Roman marble was not eternal, a lasting legacy in the earth. And yet, remarkably, many Roman structures survived. The Pantheon, despite cracks and age, remained standing, a feat of engineering so advanced that modern architects still study its dome. The Colosseum, though partially collapsed by multiple earthquakes, notably in 847 and 1349 CE, remains one of the world's most iconic ruins. Roman aqueducts still run through parts of modern Italy. Some roads still serve modern traffic. What made these structures endure? Engineering by redundancy. Massive columns, deep foundations, layered materials. Use of pozzolanic concrete, which flexed slightly and resisted cracking. Intentional design features, arches, vaults, and domes that distributed stress. But the true legacy is not in the buildings. It's in the Roman belief that systems could survive disruption, that continuity could be reasserted after disturbance through law, ritual, and memory. Even if the stones fell, the stories endured. A city that never stopped trembling. Rome today still experiences tremors. Mild earthquakes shake Lazio every few decades. While not as deadly as in central Italy or the Apennines, they remain a reminder that Rome's foundation is not unshakable. In 2009, after a major earthquake struck L'Aquila, attention turned briefly to the vulnerability of Italy's historic architecture. Churches, museums, and ancient buildings were reevaluated. Restoration began. But again, the old Roman impulse resurfaced: restore, preserve, continue. And in that continuity, we hear echoes of the past. In the way modern engineers reinforce ancient walls with steel supports hidden inside marble facades. In the way archaeologists gently document cracks as historical clues, not flaws. In the way Rome is still called the Eternal City, even when the ground beneath it is known to move. Because perhaps the point was never about literal permanence. Perhaps the Romans understood at some level that permanence is narrative, not stone. The final reflection. The Romans may not have known why the earth moved beneath their feet, but they knew that the world was full of signs, and they built a civilization to withstand, not deny those signs. Earthquakes did not topple Rome in a single moment. They whispered through its temples, cracked its columns, rattled its streets. They unsettled the myths of stability but also revealed the strength of adaptation. And in every leaning pillar, in every crooked stone still standing centuries later, we see not the failure of Rome's dream, but its quiet, trembling success. Story 5. Stone and Silence. The Harappan civilization's quiet collapse. The winds blow soft across the baked plains of the Indus River Valley. The sky is pale and dry, the earth packed hard under the December sun. You walk past the foundations of Mohenjo-Daro, tracing your hand along the sun-warmed bricks. There are no massive statues here, no towering ziggurats or soaring temples, only quiet streets, wells, and courtyards, all made of uniform, neatly laid bricks. It feels peaceful, too peaceful. Because here, in what was once one of the world's great Bronze Age civilizations, something is missing. Not just people, but explanation. No kings, no battlefields, no collapse written in fire or iron, just emptiness. And perhaps in the silence, something deeper, a forgotten trembling beneath the stones. In this first section, we begin the story of the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization, a culture that flourished between 2600 and 1900 BCE across present-day Pakistan and northwest India. It left behind no deciphered writing, no grand tales of conquest or fall. It rose, it organized, it built, and then it faded. Could earthquakes have played a part in that disappearance? Modern science and archaeology are slowly uncovering the possible role of tectonic activity in the transformation and decline of this mysterious civilization. In a region where rivers shifted, soil dried, and cities emptied out over centuries, the story of the Harappans may well be one of resilience tested by an earth that changed beneath their feet. A civilization of brick and order. At its height, the Indus Valley civilization was the largest urban society of the Bronze Age, rivaling Egypt and Mesopotamia in size and sophistication. Its major urban centers, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dhalavira, Lothal, Kalibangan, shared remarkable features. Standardized brick sizes, grid-pattern streets, advanced drainage systems, public wells and granaries. No evidence of palaces, large temples, or identifiable rulers. This was a civilization built on civic planning, not monumental spectacle. Their cities were quietly rational, focused on functionality and order. There were seals, workshops, dockyards, and what appears to be a centralized system of weights and measures. But while they lived in apparent balance with their environment, the Harappans were surrounded by natural forces that would not remain stable forever. Living with a shifting river. The Indus and its tributaries, including the Ghaggar Hakra, were the lifeblood of the civilization. These rivers fed agriculture, trade, and daily life. But rivers shift. Geological evidence shows that the Ghaggar Hakra River, long thought to be the mythical Saraswati mentioned in later Vedic texts, began to dry up or change course around 1900 BCE, the same period during which Harappan cities show signs of abandonment or decline. Was this a result of climate change alone, or did tectonic movements, earthquakes, trigger the river's redirection? In recent decades, studies have identified fault lines near the course of the Ghaggar Hakra and other Indus tributaries. These faults could have been reactivated by seismic events, altering the topography enough to affect river flow. A single earthquake would not erase a civilization, but repeated, moderate tremors over centuries could shift the land ever so slightly, just enough to divert a river from a city, enough to change flood patterns, enough to make canals useless and fields dry. If so, the Harappans didn't face dramatic catastrophe. They faced gradual environmental betrayal. Archaeological clues in stone and soil. There is no Pompeii in the Indus Valley, no layer of ash, no toppled city preserved in mid-collapse. Instead, archaeologists find clues in patterns, changes in construction, signs of abandonment, subtle shifts in urban life. At Kalibangan, in present-day Rajasthan, the pre-Harappan settlement was destroyed possibly by an earthquake around 2600 BCE. The site was later rebuilt in Harappan fashion, suggesting that people adapted, re-established order, and carried on. But the disruption is clear in the archaeological layers. Similarly, in Dhalavira, on the salty plains of Gujarat, recent studies suggest tectonic uplift and changes in groundwater may have influenced its decline. Water reservoirs fell into disuse. The city, built with extraordinary care for rainwater harvesting, slowly emptied. Excavations at Mohenjo-Daro show buildings rebuilt multiple times over the same foundations. This might be due to floods, but it could also suggest earthquake damage and repair, a silent architectural dialogue with a moving earth. The pattern becomes clearer. Harappan cities show signs of stress but not of conquest or internal collapse. They reorganize, they reduce in scale, then eventually they are abandoned. The Harappan response: rebuild or retreat. Unlike later civilizations, the Harappans did not leave us texts to describe their worldview. We do not know how they interpreted tremors or floods. There is no equivalent of a Roman prodigum or an Egyptian ritual of restoration. But the evidence suggests a culture that adapted at least at first. Rebuilding on older foundations. Adjusting urban layouts. Shifting from large cities to smaller rural settlements. Moving eastward toward the Ganges Plain. This transformation from urban density to dispersed village life is sometimes called the late Harappan period. It reflects not so much a collapse as a slow decentralization, a turning away from cities that may have become unsustainable in a changing environment. If earthquakes did help shift rivers and disrupt agriculture, the Harappans' retreat may have been not fear, but pragmatism. Without centralized religious or royal centers to defend, they may have simply moved with the land, settling where the earth still offered water and life. It is a kind of quiet resilience, one without drama, without war, without kings. Silence as legacy. Perhaps the most haunting feature of the Indus Valley civilization is its silence. No chronicles, no tombs of pharaohs, no statues of emperors, just bricks, beads, and sewer systems. And yet in that silence there is strength. The Harappans did not resist the earth. They built with it. When it moved, when the rivers shifted, when the rain failed, when the soil dried, they moved too. They left behind not stories of conquest or collapse, but foundations that still speak in their quiet way. They remind us that survival is not always loud. Sometimes, it's in knowing when to let go. But then the question rises, like a buried fault line. If the earth moved and the rivers changed and the cities emptied, what happened to the people? Where did the Harappans go, and what did they take with them? You now stand at Dhalavira, where the desert air is dry and bright, and the white glare of salt stretches far beyond the stone reservoirs of this once thriving Harappan city. The city lies quiet, silent since its final breath more than 3,000 years ago. You trace the edge of a stepwell, marveling at its ancient geometry, its emptiness and wonder. How did it end? Slowly, suddenly. Did the people leave in panic or with quiet resignation? In Section 1, we explored the emergence and mystery of the Harappan civilization, its remarkable urban sophistication, its silent disappearance, and the potential influence of environmental changes and seismic activity. In this section, we turn our gaze toward the slow unraveling of that civilization. This is not the story of a grand battle or a single catastrophic earthquake. Rather, it is the story of a civilization that listened to the land, adapted, and when the land stopped answering, dispersed. City after city slowly emptied. Between 1900 and 1300 BCE, the major cities of the Harappan world, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Kalibangan, Rakhigarhi, and Dhalavira, underwent what archaeologists call deurbanization. Populations shrank, monumental architecture ceased, artisans disappeared, writing vanished, long-distance trade broke down. There are no signs of war, no burned layers, no mass graves. What archaeologists find instead are abandoned kilns, unfinished wells, and empty platforms. In Mohenjo-Daro, the upper citadel shows signs of reuse, buildings repurposed with less care, bricks removed and reused, structures added in haste. At Kalibangan, fire altars fell into disuse. The streets remained clean, but the standardization that once defined the city began to slip. Buildings became irregular, drainage systems clogged. It is not collapse, it is withdrawal. But why? Why would one of the most organized and technologically advanced urban societies of the ancient world, complete with sewage systems, city zoning, and flood defenses, begin to fade? One explanation now gaining ground: environmental instability triggered by seismic activity. Seismic change without sudden disaster. Let's return to the Gagar-Hakra River, a now dry seasonal stream, believed to have once been a major watercourse feeding many Harappan cities. Geological research shows that this river system was once glacially fed, but began to dry up significantly around 1900 BCE. This desiccation may not have been purely climatic. Recent geophysical studies in the region suggest that repeated earthquakes could have reactivated ancient faults, subtly altering the river gradient and topography. A small uplift of just a few meters across a broad swath of land could have caused a river to lose its force, to meander sluggishly, or to break into disconnected segments, cutting off vital water to Harappan cities. This wouldn't have been dramatic. It might have taken decades or centuries to fully feel the effects. But to a society so intimately tied to water, even small changes would have been destabilizing. Cities like Kalibangan and Baniwali, located along the Gagar-Hakra's former course, appear to have been abandoned first. Others, like Mohenjo-Daro, which relied on the Indus and a more stable water supply, lasted longer but eventually show the same signs of diminishing capacity. In Dhalavira, where elaborate rainwater harvesting systems sustained a remote urban population in the semi-arid Rann of Kutch, evidence suggests increasing water stress toward the end of its occupation. Was the ground shifting beneath them? Was their carefully engineered water system outpaced by tectonic change? We don't yet know for sure, but the circumstantial evidence is building. Listening to the earth or losing its voice. The Harappans were engineers of environment. Their cities reflect deep ecological awareness, wells aligned with aquifers, buildings oriented to prevailing winds, flood platforms raised above seasonal waters. Yet in their final centuries, these systems begin to fail. Wells dry up. Silt chokes drains. Platforms no longer protect against flooding. City layouts lose their rigidity. It's not that the Harappans forgot how to build. It's that the environment, possibly due to subtle but widespread seismic uplift or riverbed shifts, stopped responding in predictable ways. The Harappans left no stories of gods or disasters, but if they believed the land was sacred, as later South Asian traditions suggest, then to lose control of it, to watch the rivers vanish, the rains grow scarce, the land tremble, would have been deeply disorienting. And in that loss, perhaps, they chose not to rebuild but to walk away. Traces in the soil and in the genes. As Harappan cities emptied, smaller rural communities began to appear farther east, toward the Ganges basin. These were not urban. They lacked the architectural complexity of earlier sites, but they showed continuity in pottery, crafts, and agricultural practices. This has led scholars to believe that the Harappan people did not vanish. They migrated. They dispersed. They adapted to new conditions in new places, continuing their lives in smaller, more sustainable ways. Genetic studies of South Asian populations reveal ancient continuity suggesting that Harappan ancestry survives in modern populations, particularly in northwest India and Pakistan. This supports the idea of cultural transformation, not civilizational extinction. And so, a civilization built on quiet efficiency may have ended quietly, not in fire or conquest, but in thousands of small, pragmatic decisions. The sounds of a dying city. In the last days of Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa, what would people have heard? The distant creak of a dry well, the silence of an unused kiln, the slow crumble of bricks dislodged by shifting soil. A faint tremor, perhaps, felt underfoot, barely noticeable, but enough to signal that something had changed. There were no mass graves, no walls breached by invaders, but there were walls that leaned just enough, drainage that no longer drained, a subtle, stubborn refusal of the land to obey. Was that the final message from the earth, a whisper rather than a roar? The Harappans may have listened, and in response they left. The cities they had so carefully built, they simply released. But the greatest mystery remains. Why did they not return? Why were their cities never reclaimed, rebuilt, or remembered in local legend? What made the silence so complete? You stand now at Mohenjo-Daro in the early morning. The air is still. Around you rise the neatly laid bricks of a vanished city, walls half the height they once were, yet still standing in neat alignment, forming streets that lead to silence. There is no central monument, no triumphal arch, no broken throne, only order, only absence. In Section 1, we examine the material brilliance and ecological awareness of the Harappans. In Section 2, we followed the theory that subtle geological shifts, possibly seismic, played a role in altering river systems and groundwater, triggering the slow evacuation of these urban centers. Now, in this final section, we explore what came after. What does it mean to have no cultural memory of collapse? Why did later Indian traditions not preserve stories of the Harappan world? And what does this quiet exit tell us about how civilizations end and how they are remembered? A civilization without a story. Most civilizations leave behind stories of their fall. The Romans chronicled their fatting empire through the eyes of bishops and emperors. The Mesopotamians told of floods and kings overthrown. The Egyptians marked invasions and plagues in temple walls and scrolls. But the Harappans left no narrative. Their writing system, if it was a true script, is undeciphered. Their archaeological sites contain no inscriptions that recount historical events. There are no known oral traditions, no myths, and no hero epics that tie directly to Harappan cities. Even the Vedic texts, which came centuries later and formed the foundation of early Indian spiritual tradition, do not mention the Harappan cities by name. They speak of rivers, of tribes, of migrations, but not of a lost civilization. Why this silence? Some possibilities. No collapse to remember. The transformation may have been slow, decentralized, and non-violent. The shift from urban centers to rural settlements lacked the drama that often fuels mythology. Cultural disjunction. The Harappan world may have been linguistically and culturally distinct from the later Indo-Aryan populations that composed the Vedic texts. Lost through time. Oral traditions may have existed, but were lost in the 3,000 years that followed. Whatever the reason, the Harappan story is not told. It must be reconstructed from broken bricks, shifted sediments, and hints in satellite images. It is a story of what might have been felt, not what was said. A culture of adaptation, not defiance. Most ancient societies resisted change until collapse forced it. They clung to cities, religions, monuments, even as floods rose or invaders came. The Harappans appear to have done the opposite. They adjusted their architecture, moved when needed, and ultimately let go of the cities when their environment no longer supported them. Unlike later societies that fought to preserve temples or fortresses, the Harappans do not appear to have tried to monumentalize their past. This suggests a worldview less focused on legacy and more attuned to survival. A worldview in which rebuilding was not always the answer, and where the Earth's signals were perhaps accepted rather than challenged. The Harappans likely understood their landscape as something alive to be listened to, not dominated. And when it stopped speaking in water, they walked away. The final movement, from bricks to fields. As the Indus cities emptied, populations shifted east and south. Smaller communities formed in the Ganges plain, where rainfall agriculture was more dependable than the erratic rivers of the northwest. This migration appears not as a collapse, but as a repatterning of civilization. The late Harappan period is marked by simplified pottery styles, less standardized brick making, diminished long-distance trade, continued farming and animal husbandry. The skills of the Harappan world didn't vanish. They were carried forward, transformed, dispersed, and eventually absorbed into new cultural frameworks. This slow diffusion left no singular event to remember. No one event marked the end. The people moved and the stones remained. The earth kept moving. Centuries passed. The Harappan sites were slowly covered by alluvium, the slow flood of silt and dust brought by rivers that no longer served cities. Some sites were buried whole, preserved in mud. Others eroded under the sun and wind. Occasional tremors likely continued to reshape the region, none large enough to destroy, but enough to ensure that foundations shifted, wells dried, bricks cracked. And through all this, the story remained quiet. The ground, never violent, was persistent. It refused to remain still, and in doing so, slowly erased one of the world's earliest great civilizations from view. Rediscovery and the modern echo. It wasn't until the 1920s that British archaeologists, working along railway lines, stumbled upon Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and realized they had uncovered a civilization lost to history. The scale, organization, and uniformity stunned the world. Yet even today, less than 10% of known Harappan sites have been fully excavated, and new tools, satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, sediment analysis continue to reveal new patterns. Recent studies in geoarchaeology suggest that fault lines near major Harappan cities were active during the period of decline. Ancient riverbeds were altered by tectonic uplift or seismic shifts. Soil chemistry changed in patterns consistent with floodplain disruption. These findings reinforce the idea that the Harappan people were not destroyed, but displaced by an environment that became unfamiliar, unstable, and unpredictable. They didn't fight the earth. They listened. And then they left. A final reflection. What can we learn from a civilization that built no pyramids, left no kings, and offered no explanation for its end? Perhaps that survival is not always about domination, but about adaptation. Perhaps that greatness lies not only in what is built, but in knowing when to stop building. The Harappans may not have named their gods in stone, but they laid out cities that breathed with the land. They engineered without ego, and when the land shifted, when the rivers turned or the ground rose, they let go. They did not fall. They stepped aside. Story 6. Brittle Foundations, Earthquakes in Ming Dynasty China. The year is 1556, and in the early hours of a cold January morning, the earth beneath Shanxi province groans and splits open. In the silence that follows, villages vanish. Cliffs collapse. Homes crumble into dust. More than 800,000 people, peasants, nobles, merchants, and monks are gone. You are standing in the heart of the deadliest earthquake in recorded human history, the Jiaojing earthquake, which struck during the late Ming Dynasty. The devastation is immense, but the story, like so many others from this era, is not just about a single quake. It is about how a society complex, bureaucratic, and steeped in cosmology interprets disaster. It's about the mandate of heaven and how the earth itself could threaten emperors. This section opens a new chapter in our journey through history's seismic past. Where the Harappans left no myths, the Chinese imperial state was a master of interpretation. Earthquakes were not simply geological phenomena, they were cosmic messages, and often political threats. We begin with the Ming, a dynasty of order and spectacle, porcelain and policy, but also of fault lines both literal and figurative. The Ming Dynasty, power on shaky ground. The Ming Dynasty, 1368–1644, was a period of centralized power and monumental governance. The dynasty emerged after the fall of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty and was established by Zhu Yuanzhang, a former monk-turned-rebel leader who became the Hongwu emperor. His reign laid the groundwork for a powerful imperial bureaucracy grounded in Confucian values, massive public works like the Great Wall and Grand Canal improvements, an expanding agricultural economy, strict societal hierarchies under imperial absolutism. But the Ming were also obsessed with omens. In a society where the emperor's right to rule was based on the mandate of heaven, natural disasters were seen not as accidents, but warnings. Earthquakes, eclipses, droughts, floods, these were signs that the ruler had lost virtue, that imbalance had entered the cosmos. A tremor was never just a tremor. It was a cosmic reprimand. This mindset shaped how the Ming responded to earthquakes, and how those quakes shaped the dynasty's fate. The Jiaojing Emperor and the earthquake of 1556. In the 34th year of the reign of the Jiaojing Emperor, disaster struck. On January 23, 1556, a magnitude ~8.0 earthquake hit Huaxian County in central China. The destruction stretched across more than 500 miles. Entire communities carved into the Les Cliffs' soft, wind-blown earth collapsed. These yaodong, or cave dwellings, housed thousands of families. In a single moment, their roofs became their graves. Reports estimate that over 800,000 people died, making it the deadliest quake in history. But this was more than a human tragedy. It was a political earthquake. The Jiaojing Emperor, known for his detachment and obsession with Taoist alchemy, had largely withdrawn from court life. He neglected state affairs, delegated authority to corrupt eunuchs, and pursued personal immortality through esoteric rituals. The earthquake was seen as a judgment not by seismologists, but by scholars and officials. Court memorials poured in, warning that the emperor's neglect and moral decay had unbalanced the natural order. These were not radicals. They were Confucian officials using cosmic language to express political critique. The message was clear: heaven had spoken. Official responses: rituals over rubble. After the earthquake, the Ming court followed protocol. The emperor issued edicts of self-examination. Sacrifices were made, prayers were offered, orders were sent to aid the affected regions. But actual relief efforts were limited. Roads were impassable. Records were lost. Local governments were overwhelmed. Many survivors simply rebuilt using the same vulnerable materials, wood and less. The bureaucracy, while vast, was not structured for disaster relief. Local magistrates were often underfunded and focused more on tax collection than emergency planning. And so, while the court focused on ritual purification, ordinary people buried their dead and rebuilt their homes, exposed again to the same risks. Unlike later Qing or Republican efforts, there was no organized seismic response. The earthquake passed into the historical record as a symbol of imperial failure, but not a turning point in public safety. A pattern of shaking. The Jiaojing earthquake was not an isolated event. China's North China Plain sits atop multiple active fault lines, including the Huishan, Heiyuan, and Longminshan faults. The Ming Dynasty experienced several major earthquakes during its rule. 1373 CE, Shanxi. 1430 CE, Tianshui. 1510 CE, Beijing area. 1536 CE, Sichuan. 1556 CE, Shanxi Jiaojing quake. 1622 CE, Ningxia. Each was interpreted through the lens of the mandate of heaven. Officials wrote long reports connecting tremors to court corruption, moral decay, or failed policy. Astronomy and astrology offices were tasked with correlating celestial phenomena to seismic ones. Rather than looking for geological patterns, the state sought moral meaning. This did not make Ming China irrational. On the contrary, its scholars were deeply empirical, recording earthquakes in fine detail, comparing them, and even mapping their occurrences. But all of this took place within a framework where earthquakes were messages, not mechanisms. A fracturing faith. Over time, the repeated natural disasters of the late Ming period began to erode faith not just in the emperor, but in the system itself. Famine, flood, earthquake, rebellion. The Wanli Emperor, ruling from 1572 to 1620, presided over a dynasty increasingly unable to respond to crisis. The emperor stopped appearing in court for years. Eunuchs and regional officials grew more powerful. Taxes increased. Peasant unrest grew. By the early 1600s, as earthquakes continued to shake the land and harvests failed, the people saw more than random misfortune. They saw cosmic imbalance, a sign that the Ming had lost heaven's favor. And indeed, in 1644, the dynasty would fall. But the earth had spoken long before. So we must now ask, was the fall of the Ming shaped more by political weakness, or by a world that never stopped trembling? The year is 1622. In the distant hills of Ningxia, the earth splits once again. Cracks radiate across farmlands. Walls collapse. The noise of splitting timber and falling tiles echoes for hours. Survivors stagger into the cold air, unsure whether what just happened was a natural disaster or a cosmic verdict. This quake, one of several in the final decades of the Ming Dynasty, strikes a nation already fraying at the edges. Famine, corruption, rebellions, drought. Now the ground itself refuses to cooperate. But while the emperor may no longer appear in court regularly, the scholars still do. The memorials still flow upward, and heaven's voice, though trembling, continues to echo through the cracks. In Section 1, we explored the 1556 Jiaojing earthquake and how it reflected the Ming state's worldview, one in which seismic events were not geological, but moral. Now, in Section 2, we focus on the bureaucracy that attempted to interpret, record, and respond to earthquakes, and how the burden of those tremors began to tear at the foundations of imperial legitimacy itself. Because what happens to a political system when even the earth seems to question its right to rule? The Bureau of Astronomy and the interpretation of disaster. In Ming China, earthquakes were not recorded by scientists, they were recorded by official cosmologists. At the heart of this effort was the Imperial Astronomical Bureau, Qinxianjian, an institution tasked with monitoring heavenly patterns and reporting deviations. While we may think of this as an astrology office, it was far more than that. It was a central tool of governance. Every eclipse, comet, flood, or quake was logged, dated, and interpreted. These events were not isolated, they were woven into a tapestry of signs, guiding policy, reshuffling officials, even prompting imperial self-examination. Earthquakes, in particular, triggered a series of responses. Memorials to the emperor, often containing confessions of administrative failures. sacrificial rituals to calm heaven or express repentance, furloughs or demotions of local officials, edicts of contrition issued by the emperor, known as Zuijai, Chinese letter, in which he acknowledged personal or dynastic failings. This wasn't superstition. It was a system of cosmic accountability, one where nature's tremors were understood as feedback from the universe itself. But this system had its costs. When ritual replaces relief. After the Jiaojing earthquake of 1556 and subsequent tremors in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, imperial edicts emphasized ritual rectification over practical rebuilding. This included state-sanctioned prayers to heaven, ritual fasts by court officials, offerings at temples and ancestral shrines, confession documents sealed in boxes and buried ceremonially. These acts were sincere and consistent with Confucian Taoist cosmology, but in many cases, material aid lagged far behind symbolic response. The Ming bureaucracy, massive as it was not optimized for disaster logistics. Roads were poorly maintained in mountainous or remote areas. Tax grain sometimes rotted before it could be delivered. Local magistrates often lacked funds and were forced to choose between tax collection quotas and relief efforts. Moreover, any request for relief funding could trigger a corruption investigation, as embezzlement was common. This discouraged even well-meaning officials from requesting funds or over-reporting damage. So, while the earth cracked and communities reeled, the court responded with solemn proclamations and incense. And faith in the bureaucracy, that brittle spine of Ming governance, began to weaken. Whispers of rebellion when the earth and people align. In the late Ming, the connection between earthquakes and rebellion grew stronger not just in interpretation, but in fact. Several major uprisings occurred shortly after natural disasters, and while causation is complex, perception shaped action. In 1622, just months after the Ningxia earthquake, the region experienced a violent peasant revolt. The rebels did not cite seismic omens directly, but officials interpreted the quake as a precursor to chaos, a sign that the emperor had lost his virtue. Even earlier, after the Beijing quake of 1510, factions within the imperial court argued that the disaster was heaven's protest against eunuch domination and political corruption. When people believe that earthquakes signal divine disapproval, they may begin to see rebellion as a restoration of order, not a disruption of it. In this way, earthquakes in the Ming era weren't just natural events. They were political accelerants pressing on existing fractures, making them break open. The people beneath the collapse. For ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, traders, the earthquake was not symbolic. It was terrifying and real. The Yaodong cave dwellings of Shanxi were cheap and cool in summer, but extremely vulnerable to seismic shaking. Entire villages disappeared in landslides. Families were crushed as they slept. But there was no emergency plan, no seismic codes, no coordinated state rebuilding. For the poor, the choice was clear: rebuild or migrate. Some returned to dangerous dwellings. Others moved to more stable regions. Many turned to local temples, community relief, or secret societies that offered aid and sometimes revolutionary ideology. This reliance on non-state networks, whether religious or fraternal, only deepened the gap between the imperial government and its people. In effect, the tremors broke more than buildings. They shook the connective tissue between ruler and ruled. Cracks in the mandate. By the early 1600s, the mandate of heaven, once a powerful legitimizing force, began to falter. When earthquakes became too frequent or too deadly, the narrative shifted. Was heaven no longer interested in the Ming? Were the rituals no longer sufficient? Had virtue truly left the imperial household? The last Ming emperor, Changzhen, ruled through one of the most tumultuous periods in Chinese history, beset by natural disasters, economic crises, and rebellion. In 1644, as rebel armies reached the capital and the emperor hung himself in the palace gardens, few could doubt that the mandate had passed. Earthquakes did not cause the fall of the Ming, but they had chipped away at belief, one tremor at a time. So we must ask, did the ground beneath the Ming literally fail them? Or did they fail to hear what it was trying to say? The year is 1644. The Changzhen Emperor, the last of the Ming dynasty, ties a silk cord to a tree in the Meishan Hill garden of Beijing's Forbidden City. As rebels breach the walls, he writes a final note of remorse, blaming no one but himself. By dusk, he is dead hanged in the twilight of a dynasty that once dreamed of unshakable order. The fall of the Ming was not a surprise. It had been decades in the making. The economy was strained, the bureaucracy bloated, the army disloyal, and the weather increasingly erratic. But perhaps no single force symbolized the slow erosion of authority better than the earthquake's persistent, disruptive, and interpreted as heaven's descent. In this final section of Story 6, we consider what happens when faith in cosmic order cracks, when rituals lose their meaning, and when disaster becomes background noise. We reflect not only on the political structures that faltered, but also on the ordinary people who lived and died beneath them. Because in the end, earthquakes in Ming China didn't just kill. They revealed. The final earthquakes, symbols of collapse. The Ming dynasty's last decades were riddled with disasters. The 1620s-30 saw an unprecedented wave of droughts, floods, and famines across northern and central China. Locust swarms decimated already strained grain harvests. Earthquakes struck Ningxia, Shanxi, and the Les Plateau with disturbing frequency. In 1638, a quake near Beijing cracked walls in the capital, just as rebel leader Li Zicheng was gaining ground in the countryside. Unlike earlier centuries, these disasters no longer prompted wide-scale ritual repentance. The imperial household, paralyzed by infighting and limited resources, had little energy left for cosmic pageantry. Earthquakes became commonplace, their meanings dulled by repetition. Where earlier generations had viewed tremors as warnings, by the 1640s, many saw them as signs of inevitability. Faith in heaven's will, once the glue holding the empire together, was fractured. The aftershocks of belief, the mandate rewritten. After the Ming fell, the Qing dynasty, led by Manchu conquerors from the north, seized Beijing and proclaimed a new beginning. They too embraced the language of the mandate of heaven, using the Ming's inability to control natural disasters as proof that heaven had withdrawn its blessing. Qing historians retroactively framed the frequent earthquakes of the late Ming as a cosmic rejection of a corrupt order of judgment by nature. This was politically convenient. It justified conquest and pacified fears, but it also continued a long tradition, reading earthquakes not as geology but as ethics. Yet even this interpretation began to fade. Over time, the Qing state shifted toward pragmatic explanations of seismic activity. They began to invest in early warning systems and supported scholarship in the natural sciences. Though still deeply influenced by traditional cosmology, they showed signs of adjustment. The world was shifting scientifically, politically, and socially, and the ground, as always, continued to move. The people in the dust. Amid this dynastic drama, we must remember the ordinary people, the millions who lived, worked, and died in the margins. For the peasant living in a cave dwelling in Shanxi. For the scholar whose library collapsed in the 1556 quake. For the monk whose monastery cracked at the base of Mount Hua. The earthquake was neither divine message nor political symbol. It was a real event, sudden, disorienting, often final. Their deaths rarely made it into official court records. their survival strategies building on firmer ground, migrating to safer regions, adapting architecture were passed orally, not through edicts. Yet they endured. Even when the state faltered, even when heaven was silent, people rebuilt. Brick by brick, beam by beam. They lived with the risk because there was no alternative. Memory and the forgotten disaster. Curiously, despite the scale of events like the 1556 Jiaojing earthquake, there is little cultural memory of them in modern China. Unlike the 1976 Tangshan earthquake, widely remembered for its political significance, the Ming-era disasters have faded into historical obscurity. Why? Partly because they were absorbed into dynastic narratives. Partly because science replaced ritual and the meaning of tremors shifted. And partly because the victims left few records. The people buried beneath Les Cliffs in 1556 left no writings, no paintings, no monuments. Their story was flattened by time, by empire, and by the bureaucracies that preferred symbols to stories. Lessons beneath the stones. The story of earthquakes in Ming China is not one of epic collapse, but of layered failure. A state too rigid to adapt. A court more focused on ritual than relief. A belief system too centralized to respond to scattered suffering. A population that rebuilt despite being forgotten. It is a reminder that belief can be brittle. That cosmic systems, no matter how well ordered, must still rest on the real earth which moves, shakes, and does not care about ritual schedules. And it reminds us that disasters, though often viewed through the lens of kings and courts, are most deeply felt by the nameless many. Closing reflection. What remains of the Ming today? Porcelain poetry, walls and canals, and the faint scars in the Les Plateau visible from above where cities once stood and trembled. History often remembers the noise of war, the flash of rebellion, the declarations of emperors. But perhaps we should also remember the silence after an earthquake, the way the dust settles, the way people step into the ruins and decide to begin again. Even as the mandate cracked and the dynasty fell, the people endured. And still the earth waits. Story 7, Tremors in the Andes, Inca infrastructure and the earth that would not hold. You are now standing high in the Andes Mountains, thousands of meters above sea level. The air is thin, the horizon jagged. The sun cuts sharp shadows across a network of precisely carved stones so finely fitted that even centuries later, not even a knife blade can pass between them. This is Cusco, once the beating heart of the Inca Empire. But it is not just the capital of an empire, it is a city built on shifting ground, where the earth trembles regularly and violently. And yet, much of it still stands. As you run your fingers along the cold edges of a polygonal wall, you wonder, how did these people, without metal tools or wheels, build such enduring architecture in one of the world's most earthquake-prone regions? What did they know about the earth beneath them, and what lessons did they leave behind, hidden in stone? This is not a story of collapse. It is a story of resilience through design, a civilization that recognized the instability of their world and built not in spite of it, but with it. The Andes, a land that shakes. The Andes Mountains, stretching along the western edge of South America, are the result of a dramatic tectonic collision between the Nazca and South American plates. This collision is ongoing, violent, and ancient. Earthquakes here are frequent and often massive. The land is young, geologically speaking, rising, crumbling, and reshaping itself constantly. Deep valleys, steep escarpments, and unstable slopes define the terrain. In this unstable land, the Inca did not just survive, they thrived. Their empire stretched over 2,500 miles, encompassing mountains, deserts, and rainforests. They built roads, terraces, and temples across this ever-moving landscape. But nowhere is their mastery more evident than in Cusco, their imperial capital. Cusco, navel of the world. In Inca cosmology, Cusco was not just a city. It was the center of the universe, the navel of the world, Cusco in Quechua. From here, all roads radiated outward. Four great administrative regions Sayas converged here, and at its center stood the Coricancha, or Golden Temple, the spiritual heart of the empire. But Cusco was not built on solid ground. It sits atop a series of fault zones, and its history is laced with seismic activity. Yet the city was engineered with this reality in mind. The stones of Cusco were laid with such care, such geometric complexity, that when earthquakes came, and they did, often the structures absorbed the shock and stayed upright. This was not luck. It was intentional design, born from generations of observation. The secret of the stones. The Incas built with ashlar masonry, stones cut and shaped to fit together without mortar. But more than that, they employed polygonal stonework, using irregular but precisely interlocking stones. These stones fit so tightly that they resist separation, are slightly rounded at the edges, allowing them to move during tremors, were often laid with inward-leaning walls for stability. Use a system of seismic damping, allowing the energy of a quake to disperse without breaking the structure. Modern engineers who study Inca masonry are often astounded. These walls perform better than many modern buildings during earthquakes. Even after centuries, many Inca walls remain intact, while colonial-era constructions built on top of them have crumbled repeatedly. In Sacsayhuaman, the immense fortress overlooking Cusco, the largest stones weigh over 100 tons, and yet they are set with such precision that no two stones are alike, and none have fallen. It is not just strength, it is flexibility. The Incas understood that in a land that moves, buildings must breathe with the earth. Lessons from earthquakes past. Although no written records from the Inca themselves survive, the empire did not use a formal writing system. Oral traditions and colonial-era chronicles provide some clues. Spanish chroniclers, writing after the conquest in the 1530s, noted that the Incas spoke of earthquakes as living forces, sometimes divine, sometimes angry. Earthquakes were often explained as the movement of the gods or ancestors. Sacrifices and rituals were offered after quakes, not to prevent them, but to restore harmony. Importantly, the Incas did not seek to resist nature, but to work with it. Their understanding of seismic risk was experiential, passed down through generations. In Pisac, Ollantaytambo, and Machu Picchu, all highland settlements, structures show similar earthquake-resistant techniques. Even agricultural terraces, built on slopes vulnerable to landslides, used drainage layers and flexible retaining walls, likely in part to withstand the effects of tremors and heavy rains. This was not primitive engineering. It was the result of thousands of years of adaptation to a region that offered great beauty and constant danger. The conquest, when new stones replaced old ones. When the Spanish arrived in the 1530s, they admired the quality of Inca construction, but misunderstood its purpose. They tore down temples like the Coricancha and built churches in their place. They reused Inca stones, but mortared them together in European fashion. They constructed rigid walls atop flexible foundations. Inevitably, earthquakes struck again, and time after time the pattern repeated. Inca walls stayed. Spanish structures fell. In 1746, a massive earthquake destroyed much of Lima, the colonial capital. In Cusco, the damage was less severe, but once again, the colonial additions crumbled and the Inca foundations remained. Even today, walking through Cusco, you can see this legacy. Spanish churches built on top of Inca platforms like children's blocks stacked on bedrock. The earth has judged them many times, and always it favors the older stones. A city that breathes. You return to the streets of Cusco, watching a modern car pass by walls built before Columbus. The stones are worn smooth from centuries of touch, rain, and quake, yet they hold. Each stone whispers of survival through movement, of architecture born not from dominance over nature, but partnership with it. This is the heart of the Inca approach to the earth. Understand it, respect it, and build accordingly. Their buildings don't resist earthquakes. They live through them. So now we must ask, how did an empire without a written language leave behind some of the most enduring seismic engineering in human history? And what does that say about what it means to truly understand the earth? The Spanish described the Inca road system as one of the wonders of the world, even as they tore it apart. It stretched across deserts and mountains, swamps and valleys, and through it all, it endured the shaking ground, sometimes breaking, often holding. In Section 1, we explored how Inca stonework revealed an intuitive and practiced understanding of seismic movement. In Section 2, we descend from the walls of Cusco into the veins of the empire itself, its infrastructure, administrative networks, and everyday technologies that made survival in an earthquake-prone landscape possible. For the Incas, seismic resilience was not a feature of a few elite buildings, it was a part of how the entire civilization was built. Their empire functioned not in defiance of nature, but in rhythm with it. A road through the mountains. The Quhapac-Nian, the Inca road system, covered more than 25,000 miles, traversing some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. It connected the capital of Cusco with distant provinces in modern-day Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. It crossed deep valleys carved by glacial erosion, volcanic ridges and earthquake-prone zones, rivers subject to sudden flooding and landslides, elevations over 5,000 meters. In many ways, the road system was a living infrastructure, adapting constantly to the mountain's moods. Some key features: suspension bridges made of braided grass, flexible, renewable, and intentionally replaced every 1-2 years. These bridges would sway with tremors but rarely collapse. Stone staircases carved directly into cliff faces, which reduced loose rubble and erosion. Drainage systems built along even the steepest stretches, carrying rain and runoff safely away. Retaining walls that allowed roads to cling to unstable slopes. This was not a road designed for the convenience of wheeled carts because the Incas didn't use them. It was designed for foot traffic and pack animals, especially the llama, which was agile on rugged paths. And when earthquakes came, and they did frequently, sections of road might crack or shift, but the network as a whole held firm. Why? Because the system was modular. Roads were segmentally built and maintained, often by local communities under the MITA labor system, meaning no single disaster could sever the entire network. It was resilience through distributed responsibility. The MITA system, labor for earth, labor for empire. The Incas didn't rely on coinage or wage labor. Their empire was built on communal obligations, a system called MITA, where citizens contributed labor to the state in exchange for security, food, and access to shared lands. MITA wasn't just used to build temples and roads, it was infrastructure maintenance. When an earthquake damaged a bridge, local communities were mobilized to rebuild it. When landslides buried a road, people cleared it. When a storage house or quilca fell, the food was salvaged and the structure replaced. This created a civilization where repair was as valued as construction. The system wasn't perfect, it could be coercive, and under the Spanish it would become exploitative. But in the Inca context, it meant the state could respond quickly to disasters. There was no delay while orders moved through bureaucracy. There was no foreign engineering team sent in years later. Instead, there was a network of people who understood the land, knew the techniques, and had the duty and skill to restore what was broken. In a seismic landscape, This made all the difference. Terraces and water, agriculture in motion. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of Inca resilience is the agricultural terrace. These stone-faced platforms, found across the sacred valley and beyond, transformed steep, unstable slopes into productive farmland. But they were more than just horizontal growing space, they were geotechnical masterpieces. Key features included layered construction, bottom gravel for drainage, then sand, then topsoil. Stone retaining walls, angled and dry-laid to allow for movement and flexibility. Water channels, allowing for irrigation and runoff redirection. Microclimates, created by elevation and exposure, offering frost protection. Earthquakes test walls, especially long retaining ones. But these terraces, thanks to their flexible modular design, could often absorb shocks rather than collapse. More importantly, if a few terraces failed, the impact was localized. The system was built in interlocking yet independent zones. This mirrors how the Inca Empire functioned as a whole, integrated but not brittle. It could crack without shattering. Religious architecture and ritual geography. Just as important as infrastructure was the Incas' spiritual relationship with the land. Earthquakes weren't random. They were seen as signs from the gods, or more precisely, from the earth itself, often personified as Pachamama, the Earth Mother. Many of the Incas' sacred sites were built on or near fault lines, which may seem foolish until you consider their worldview. Faults were sacred places where the earth spoke. Temples like Coricancha, Sacsayhuaman, and Ollantaytambo sit near seismic zones. These were not places to avoid, but places to honor, appease, and protect. In this context, earthquake-resistant architecture wasn't just engineering, it was cosmic alignment. The fit of the stones, the breathability of the walls, the respect shown to natural features, they were all part of a spiritual contract. When the earth shook, it wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical, and to live in such a place was to accept that instability and build accordingly. Colonial ignorance and the unraveling of Inca resilience. After the conquest, the Spanish began to replace Inca systems with European ones: rigid hierarchies, centralized taxation, and monetary labor systems. The Mita was retooled for mining labor, not public infrastructure. The roads and terraces fell into disrepair, as the communal systems that maintained them were dismantled. The earthquake-resistant techniques were misunderstood, mocked, or ignored. When earthquakes struck, and they did, frequently Spanish structures collapsed. But they didn't know how to rebuild in the old way. In some cases, they used the surviving Inca stones to build new walls, but they mortared them, removing the very flexibility that made them survive in the first place. And so, the old stones remembered, but the new ones forgot. Echoes of the stones. Today, in modern Peru, seismic risk is still high. Earthquakes continue to shape the highlands, but in many places, people still live near or among Inca-era structures, walls, and terraces that remain where colonial and modern buildings have fallen. What does this tell us? That sometimes, survival doesn't come from resisting nature, but from understanding it intimately, from generations of knowledge, communal effort, and deep respect. The Incas, through intuition and experience, built a world that could shake and not fall. So we are left to wonder, what would our cities look like today if we built not for permanence, but for movement? Not for domination, but for dialogue with the earth. The year is 1650, more than a century after the Spanish conquest. In Cusco, the heart of the fallen Inca Empire, churches tower where temples once stood, and colonial mansions occupy the foundations of imperial palaces. Then the ground begins to move. A violent earthquake rips through the city. The walls of Spanish buildings crack, topple, and slide into streets. Church towers crumble. Arches collapse. Dust clouds fill the air. But as the shaking stops and silence settles over the wounded capital, a curious pattern emerges once again. The Inca walls remain standing, just as they did in 1582, and again in 1787, and later in 1950. Time and again, the seismic resilience of Inca architecture quietly asserts itself. But this story is not just about stone. It's about survival, cultural, material, and philosophical in a world where the ground is never still. In this final section of Story 7, we explore what happened after the fall. We trace how Inca resilience endured even under conquest, how its wisdom was forgotten, rediscovered, and how it might speak to us today. The shaking city, colonial earthquakes, and indigenous foundations. Earthquakes continued to ravage the Andes long after the end of the Inca Empire. 1582 Arequipa earthquake, 1650 Cusco earthquake, 1687 coastal quake and tsunami, 1746 Lima earthquake, which destroyed nearly the entire city, 1950 Cusco earthquake, one of the most destructive in modern times. Each of these disasters repeated a pattern. Spanish colonial structures, often built with European-style arches and masonry, collapsed catastrophically. Inca stone foundations, particularly those using polygonal, mortarless construction, endured the shaking. Even where damage occurred, the Inca walls never fully failed. In 1650, when Cusco lay in ruins once again, rebuilding efforts relied heavily on surviving Inca foundations. It was not a celebration of indigenous engineering, it was necessity. Stone by stone, the Spanish recognized what the Inca had long known. You cannot dominate the earth. You must build with it. What survived the conquest? Though the empire fell, much of its infrastructure remained intact. Roads still connected Andean villages and market towns. Terraces were farmed for centuries after the conquest, and many still are today. Quilcas, storehouses in the highlands, were used well into the colonial period. Ritual knowledge about the land and its movements was passed down orally. Even more importantly, Inca principles lived on in the ways Andean people continued to build, cultivate, and understand the environment. In remote villages, houses were still made with flexible stone and thatch, capable of withstanding tremors better than tile and brick. Agricultural terraces were repaired by community labor, often without official oversight. The empire was gone, but its relationship with the earth survived in practice. Erased knowledge and rediscovery. European observers were often blind to what they were seeing. To them, Inca building techniques were primitive, compared to civilized brick and mortar. Andean cosmology was dismissed as superstition. Communal labor was replaced with forced systems like the colonial mita, extracting labor without returning services. Much of the seismic logic embedded in Inca infrastructure was therefore lost, not because it was ineffective, but because it was invisible to outsiders. It wasn't until the 20th century, with the rise of seismology and earthquake engineering, that scholars began to revisit ancient Andean construction with new eyes. Engineers marveled at the high energy absorption of interlocking stonework, durability of Inca retaining walls even on unstable slopes, longevity of seismic-resistant design in places like Cusco, Pisac, and Ollantaytambo. They found that Inca walls didn't resist motion, they flexed with it, distributing energy and reducing structural failure. Modern architecture began borrowing from these principles, especially in earthquake-prone regions, but much had already been forgotten. Machu Picchu, the unshaken city. Perhaps the most famous example of Inca seismic wisdom is Machu Picchu, rediscovered by the outside world in 1911. Perched on a mountaintop ridge, in a seismically active area, the city's stone structures have survived centuries of tremors, torrential rains, and landslides with remarkable stability. Key features include deep stone foundations, sometimes up to 3 meters, sophisticated drainage system that prevents soil erosion, tilted walls that lean slightly inward for stability, polished ashlar stonework in temples, and rougher but still interlocking stone in houses. Machu Picchu's continued preservation, despite its precarious location, is no accident. It is a testament to a civilization that understood where and how to build. It's not just archaeology, it's engineering with memory. Modern lessons from an ancient empire. The Inca did not have seismographs or tectonic theory. They did not have mathematical models or reinforcement steel. But they had something else. Observational knowledge, passed over centuries of experience. Adaptation, learned through repeated disaster and rebuilding. Spiritual respect for the land, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner to be honored. In an age where modern cities continue to fall to earthquakes, where concrete collapses and infrastructure fails, the Inca example raises difficult questions. Have we built for convenience rather than for continuity? Have we prioritized rigidity over resilience? Do we believe in controlling nature when nature has never agreed to be still? The stones that outlived empires. In Cusco today, you can still place your hand on stones that survived dozens of earthquakes and a complete cultural overthrow. You'll see people walking past colonial churches, rebuilt many times, resting on foundations that have never moved. And if you look closely, you might see a kind of dialogue between past and present, between those who built for the ages and those still learning how. The Inca Empire fell, but its wisdom endured not in words but in quiet stone, still locked in place. Closing reflection. The story of Inca resilience is not just a historical curiosity. It is a reminder that ancient people, often dismissed as primitive, understood survival in ways we are only beginning to appreciate again. They did not stop the earth from shaking. They expected it. And so, they built a world that could move and not fall. In an age of climate uncertainty and rising risk, perhaps the question is not how to build monuments that defy nature, but how to build systems, communities, and cities that listen to it. The Incas did not write their legacy in books. They wrote it in stone. And the stones are still here. Story 8, The Sleepers Beneath Lisbon, Everyday Life Before the 1755 Quake. It is the morning of November 1st, 1755. The day begins with bells. It is All Saints' Day, a sacred celebration across Catholic Europe. In Lisbon, the capital of the Portuguese Empire, church bells ring over hills and tiled rooftops. The city is still. Inside thousands of homes, candles flicker before altars. The faithful dress in dark clothing and walk to one of the many churches scattered across the city's 7 hills. Some kneel, others whisper prayers, some light incense. They do not know that beneath them, the earth is preparing to split, that a tectonic fault deep in the Atlantic Ocean is shifting, slowly, until it can no longer hold, that this morning, this holy day, will become one of the deadliest natural disasters in European history. But this story does not begin with destruction. It begins in the quiet moments before. This is the story of Lisbon as it was a city unaware it was living on borrowed time. We explore the architecture, daily rhythms, religious beliefs, and quiet vulnerabilities that filled Lisbon's final hours of peace. Because to understand what was lost in the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, we must first understand what stood. Lisbon in 1755, a global city at its height. In 1755, Lisbon was not a sleepy medieval backwater. It was one of the most important cities in Europe and the crown jewel of the Portuguese Empire. With trade links to Brazil, Africa, India, and Macau, Lisbon was flush with gold, sugar, spices, and slaves. The streets hummed with commerce. Ships filled the Tagus River. From the waterfront, one could look out over a world Portugal had touched and profited from. Some of the city's features: over 250,000 residents, making it one of the largest cities in Europe at the time. A city of tiled facades, steep hills, and narrow medieval lanes. Dozens of churches and convents, many filled with relics, gold, and wood carvings. The Ribeira Palace, the royal residence, located near the riverfront. A thriving class of merchants, artisans, clergy, and servants. A growing population of enslaved Africans, integrated into household labor, construction, and shipping. It was a city of hierarchy, deeply Catholic, profoundly ritualized, and deeply proud. But it was also a city built of vulnerable materials: stone, wood, and densely packed homes. The upper classes lived in heavy masonry buildings, richly adorned but structurally rigid. The poor lived in crowded tenements, often made of timber and wattle, stacked like kindling. Lisbon was impressive but unprepared. A morning of candles and confession. On the morning of All Saints' Day, Lisbon's churches were full. In an era before electric lighting, churches were lit with thousands of candles. These were placed before icons, around altars, and beside the tombs of saints. The smell of beeswax and incense mixed with the scent of old stone and polished wood. At dawn, the faithful walked uphill to Mass. Some carried offerings, others simply came to sit in silence. Few questioned the rituals. Catholicism saturated every aspect of Lisbon's society. It shaped the calendar, the legal system, and the rhythm of the workday. Most Lisboetas, regardless of class, believed in divine order, that God oversaw the world, and that saints and relics offered protection. If disaster came, it was believed to be a test, a punishment, or a sign, but few expected catastrophe on such a sacred morning. In some churches, the Mass had already begun. In others, worshippers had just taken their seats. It was a city kneeling when the shaking began. Daily life on the hills. Beyond the churches, Lisbon's daily life unfolded in layers, both socially and topographically. On the higher hills, nobility and merchants lived in large homes. These areas had more stone construction and offered better views, but were harder to evacuate. Down in the Baixa downtown, buildings were densely packed, and the narrow streets wound unpredictably. Vendors set up stalls in the public squares. Fishermen worked along the docks. Porters carried crates of imported wares. Washerwomen hauled laundry to public fountains. Children ran through alleys. Servants swept thresholds. Most buildings were 3 to 5 stories tall, with the wealthiest families living on the lower levels and the poor on the top floors closest to the sky, but also to danger. And under all of it, no reinforcement, no seismic awareness, and no memory of the last major quake, which had occurred over 200 years earlier, in 1531. Seismology did not exist. The idea of earthquakes as geological rather than divine was not widely accepted. To most, the ground was solid. The stones were eternal. No one imagined that the earth could rise and fall like water. Architecture without earthquake awareness. Much of Lisbon was built in what we might call late medieval or Baroque fashion. Architecture was elegant, decorative, and heavily vertical. Massive stone churches, some with bell towers over 50 meters tall. Palaces with ornate facades, columns, and grand staircases. Dense neighborhoods with cantilevered balconies and open timber framing. But none of this was built with earthquake resistance in mind. In fact, many features made the buildings more vulnerable. Heavy roof tiles and stone cornices could easily fall. Narrow streets limited escape and magnified the impact of falling debris. No standard building code existed. Each neighborhood had its own customs. Wooden internal structures, which burned easily once fire spread. If an earthquake were to strike, there were no fire breaks, no emergency response system, and no understanding of aftershocks. Lisbon was elegant, Lisbon was global. But Lisbon was not ready. Faults beneath and faults within. While the physical vulnerability was invisible, there were other kinds of cracks beneath Lisbon's surface. The city, though outwardly devout and orderly, was full of tension. Class divides were sharp, and the poor were increasingly marginalized. The Jesuits and royal officials jostled for influence over the court and education. A growing culture of Enlightenment thinking had begun to question divine intervention, but only quietly. The city's reliance on slave labor from Africa was deeply entrenched, yet rarely acknowledged as a moral contradiction. The church held massive land and wealth, while urban poverty was widespread. These were not physical weaknesses, but they would affect how the city responded to crisis. Authority was hierarchical, dissent was silenced, the crown was unchallenged. In short, Lisbon was not just physically vulnerable to disaster, it was institutionally rigid, unable to bend easily when it needed to. The calm before. And so, in the early hours of November 1st, 1755, Lisbon moved quietly. People bought bread, children fetched water, sailors prepared to unload cargo from Brazil, monks sang morning hymns, women lit candles and whispered to saints. The city had no idea it was living in its final moments of continuity. The first tremor would strike just after 9:30 a.m. It would last for several minutes. It would be followed by fire, then by water, then by silence. But at that moment before it all began, Lisbon stood like so many cities have, confident, faithful, busy, and unaware. So we must ask, when a city stands on invisible fault lines, both literal and metaphorical, how can anyone know when its quietest morning will become its last? You are standing in the Baixa district of Lisbon near the Tagus River. The streets are cobbled, the buildings tall and close. Church bells still echo from the hills above. All Saints' Day is fully underway. It's now just after 9:30 a.m. on November 1, 1755. And then, without warning, the earth begins to move. It starts as a low rumble like a growl from beneath the streets. Glass trembles in its panes, hanging lamps sway, people pause mid-step, a few birds lift from rooftops. Then suddenly the shaking becomes violent. It is not a single jolt. It is a series of convulsions, lasting between 6 to 9 minutes according to survivor accounts. The ground ripples, buildings twist and sway, masonry cracks, buckles, and falls. Church towers snap and crash down onto worshippers. The great stone walls of the Ribeira Palace along the waterfront crumble. Lisbon is coming apart. This is not just an earthquake. This is one of the most devastating compound disasters in history, where earthquake, fire, and tsunami follow in horrifying sequence. In this section, we walk through the day itself, not in dramatic flashes, but in the slow, relentless, factual detail of what happened. The shaking, November 1, 1755, 9:40 a.m. From the hills to the riverfront, Lisbon breaks. Churches collapse, burying congregations under stone, wood, and flame. Stone buildings split from roof to foundation. The upper stories crash onto narrow streets. Timber-framed houses twist and burn from overturned candles. Cisterns rupture, flooding basements and cellars. Cries fill the air, then are smothered by falling debris. Reports from the time say that more than 30 major churches were either destroyed or severely damaged. Among them was the Grand Igreja de São Vicente de Fora and the towering Carmel convent, which still stands today as a ruin, open to the sky. The Royal Ribeira Palace, situated near the river, was entirely destroyed. The royal family survived only because they were away from the city celebrating All Saints' Day at a hunting lodge. Within 10 minutes, tens of thousands were dead or buried. But the shaking was only the beginning. The fire's midday inferno. As people crawled from rubble or gathered in open squares, they began to light candles to pray for the dead. The quake had already toppled candles in churches and homes. Fires sparked across the city. With buildings made of dry wood and densely packed, flames leapt from block to block. Strong winds from the Tagus pushed fire uphill. There was no firefighting infrastructure. Water lines had burst. Cisterns were buried. The city was ill-equipped to contain even a small blaze, let alone dozens at once. The fires raged for 5 days, burning whole neighborhoods, warehouses filled with sugar and textiles, churches with wooden roofs and flammable ornaments, archives, records, libraries, and entire lifetimes of documentation. Ironically, the flames offered no sanctuary for the living. Those who had survived the quake now faced heat, smoke, and collapsing, burning timbers. Those who ran toward the river thought they might escape by sea. They could not have known that the sea had its own plan. The tsunami, the river withdraws. Around an hour after the earthquake, as the fires grew and the tremors subsided, a strange event was recorded by many survivors. The Tagus River receded. Boats were left on dry riverbed. Fish flopped in the shallows. Crowds gathered at the waterfront to stare. And then came the wave. Estimates suggest that the tsunami was between 5 to 10 meters high when it returned, surging up the Tagus and into the city. It swept away boats and piers, survivors seeking refuge on the waterfront, rubble, debris, and bodies, pushing it all inland and then back out to sea. The tsunami was not a single wave but a series, recorded as far away as Ireland, southern England, and the Caribbean. In Cadiz, Spain, the wave caused serious flooding. In North Africa, parts of Morocco's coast were damaged. Lisbon's lower city, already in ruins, was now underwater and in flames. The scale of destruction. Modern estimates suggest that 90,000 people died in Lisbon alone, some say more. Considering the city's population was around 250,000, nearly a third of the population perished. Beyond Lisbon, other parts of Portugal and southern Spain suffered heavy losses. Entire villages were swallowed or burned. The destruction included 85% of the city's buildings, either collapsed or severely damaged. Almost every major church and monastery. The royal palace and the royal library, which held over 70,000 books. Scientific instruments, artwork, archives, and architectural treasures. It wasn't just a city that fell, it was an entire worldview. The spiritual, political, and intellectual centers of Lisbon collapsed, leaving rubble and silence in their place. Survivors, chaos, and aftershocks. In the days that followed, aftershocks continued, many of them severe. Fires burned unchecked. The dead lay unburied in the streets. Looting began in ruined neighborhoods. Survivors slept in open fields, terrified of falling masonry or rising flames. King Jose I, traumatized by the event, refused to live inside walls again. For the rest of his reign, he lived in a complex of tents and pavilions in the hills, known as the Real Baraka. The population was leaderless, afraid, and surrounded by death. For many, it seemed that God had abandoned Lisbon. And yet, even amid despair, efforts began quietly, then swiftly to restore order. Philosophy shaken, the earthquake and the Enlightenment. The Lisbon earthquake did more than topple buildings. It shook Europe's intellectual foundations. How could a loving God allow such devastation, especially on a holy day? Why were churches destroyed while brothels and taverns stood? Was this divine punishment or natural law? Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau responded passionately. Voltaire's Candide famously mocked the optimistic belief that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. In the ashes of Lisbon, such optimism rang hollow. The quake sparked a debate that continues today. Do natural disasters carry moral meaning? Or are they reminders of a world governed by forces we neither control nor fully understand? These questions wouldn't stop the aftershocks, but they would change the way Europe viewed nature, faith, and fate. The emergence of Pombal. In the chaos, one man would rise to take control. Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal. He would direct the recovery with authoritarian clarity. He would bring scientific thinking to the ruins. He would impose order where chaos reigned. But at this moment, in the hours after the quake, Pombal was just another survivor among thousands. And as the city burned, the earth cracked, and the river rose and fell, a question hung in the smoke-filled sky. How do you rebuild a world that no longer makes sense? The smoke was still rising when the questions began. Not philosophical ones, those would come later, but practical ones. Where will people sleep tonight? How do we stop the fires? What do we do with the bodies? And when do we begin again? Lisbon had been shattered physically, psychologically, spiritually. Yet within days of the 1755 earthquake, a plan for recovery emerged, not from the church or the nobility, but from a single determined figure. Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the Marquis of Pombal. Where others prayed, Pombal acted. He would rebuild Lisbon, but not as it was. He would impose a new order, one that broke with the medieval past and stood as a model for future cities. He would respond to disaster not with lamentation, but with rationality, engineering, and bureaucracy. This section traces the extraordinary aftermath of the Lisbon earthquake, where out of devastation came one of the earliest examples of modern disaster response. Immediate crisis management. Pombal was not yet prime minister when the quake struck, but he was the king's trusted minister. With King José I paralyzed by fear, it was Pombal who took charge. His instructions were clear and decisive. Bury the dead and feed the living. He imposed martial law to stop looting, with looters hanged on the spot. He established emergency tent camps in nearby fields and parks. Rations were distributed, and rice was imported from India to stave off famine. He prevented mass panic by suppressing rumors and arresting doomsayers. He also took one key step that foreshadowed modern disaster science. Pombal ordered a detailed survey, sending questionnaires across Portugal to gather data on the timing of the tremors, the behavior of animals before the quake, the type and extent of structural damage, the direction of ground movement, accounts of the tsunami. This was, in effect, one of the first seismological surveys in history. At a time when most saw the event as divine judgment, Pombal saw data. The Pombaline rebuild, rationalism in stone. With the city still smoldering, Pombal moved quickly to plan a new Lisbon. He empowered a team of military engineers and architects to design and execute a massive urban reconstruction project. Some key features of the Pombaline rebuild. 1. Earthquake-resistant architecture. The most revolutionary element of the new city was the Pombaline cage, a type of internal wooden frame built within masonry walls, designed to flex during seismic activity. It absorbed shock waves. It reduced total collapse. It was pre-tested, using scale models shaken by troops marching around them. This was centuries before reinforced concrete. It represented an intuitive understanding of flexibility over rigidity, a nod, perhaps unintentionally, to ancient lessons long ignored. 2. A new urban. The narrow, winding medieval streets of the Bexa district were replaced with straight, wide boulevards laid out in a rational grid. Streets were widened to prevent fire spread. Public squares acted as open-air evacuation zones. Building heights were standardized. It was a radical departure from the old city's organic layout, and one of the earliest examples of modern urban planning after a natural disaster. 3. Bureaucratic centralization. Pombal abolished many feudal privileges, took control of guilds, and imposed strict building codes. Reconstruction was centralized and uniform, not driven by private developers. Lisbon became a city of order and symmetry, not chaos and ornamentation. For Pombal, rebuilding wasn't just about stones, it was about redefining power. Political aftershocks. Pombal's role in the reconstruction earned him both praise and enemies. The nobility saw his centralization as a threat. The Jesuits, already in conflict with Enlightenment thinkers, opposed his secular approach. The king, however, gave him near-total authority. Pombal used the crisis to restructure Portuguese society, launching educational reforms, breaking the power of the Jesuits, and reducing church influence in civil affairs. In many ways, the quake became a catalyst for Enlightenment governance in Portugal, but it also came at a cost. Pombal ruled with authoritarian zeal. Dissent was crushed. Surveillance increased. His reforms benefited the state, but not necessarily the poor or marginalized. He would eventually fall from power after King José's death, but Lisbon remained a monument to his vision. Intellectual reverberations across Europe. Far from the ruins, thinkers across Europe debated what had happened. Voltaire, in his poem on the Lisbon disaster, 1756, mocked the idea that this was a just punishment from God. Did fallen Lisbon deeper drink of vice than London, Paris, or sunlit Madrid? Voltaire's Candide, published in 1759, would forever link Lisbon to the death of naive optimism. Immanuel Kant, at just 31, wrote 3 essays analyzing the Lisbon quake. He tried to understand the natural mechanisms behind it, an early attempt to detheologize disaster. Others saw Lisbon as a test of faith, a divine warning, or an inevitable punishment for moral decay. The quake forced a collision between medieval religious cosmology, which saw disasters as divine punishment, and modern rationalism, which sought mechanical causes and social remedies. In this, Lisbon became more than a city. It became a mirror for modernity. Long-term legacies. Lisbon did not fully recover its former imperial glory. The quake revealed the fragility of both urban life and colonial empires. But its recovery reshaped disaster management. Pombal's methods prefigured modern emergency response. Architecture. The Pombaline cage was an early example of seismic design. Philosophy. The quake helped usher in the age of reason and cast doubt on simplistic theological explanations. Urban planning. Lisbon became a blueprint for rational, resilient city design. Today, if you walk through the Baixa district, you will see a city built with quiet intention. The broad avenues, the uniform facades, the earthquake-tested buildings, they are the product of trauma, turned into order. Lisbon became a city that remembered. Modern relevance, the unseen fault lines. In our own time, natural disasters continue to strike. Earthquakes in Haiti, Turkey, Japan, and Nepal. Tsunamis in Indonesia and Sri Lanka. Fires in urban centers, floods in river cities, hurricanes in coastal towns. Each brings new death, new grief, and new opportunities to ask, what do we rebuild and how? Do we preserve the past or impose new visions? Do we prepare for recurrence or pray it never returns? The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 remains a case study in catastrophe, but also in adaptation. It is a story of how a city fell and how it stood again. Lisbon's catastrophe could have ended its history. Instead, it became a turning point. Out of fire, water, and stone rose a city and a philosophy that refused to collapse into despair. Lisbon taught Europe that disasters are not just events, they are mirrors, showing what lies beneath our beliefs, our systems, and our plans. And today, as new cities rise on old fault lines, the echoes of Lisbon still ask us, if the world shakes again, what will we rebuild and what will we remember?